He satisfied every boundary she had. He broke every unspoken rule she set. And when the blood eclipse painted the sky crimson above 1,000 witnesses, he looked straight at her and said, "She was nothing." That single word destroyed a kingdom, but it also woke something far worse than any kingdom could contain. This is the story of a king who chose pride over fate, and the ghost who rose from the ashes he created. Stay with me until the very end. Drop a like. And comment the name of your city so I know where my pack is gathering tonight. The wind carried the stench of burning iron across the courtyard long before the ceremony began. Soldiers lined the perimeter in rows of black steel, shoulder to shoulder, their breath fogging in the frozen air like departing souls. Above them the sky bled. The blood eclipse stretched across the heavens in a bruised arc of deep crimson, casting everything below in the color of old wounds. It was the kind of sky that made veterans check their weapons and new recruits whisper to each other about omens their mothers once warned them never to ignore. The obsidian citadel of House Draxor rose behind the courtyard like a fist clenched against heaven. Its towers were carved from volcanic glass, and the bones of ancient beasts, polished until they reflected the eclipse in ribbons of dark fire. Silver braziers, each one taller than a mounted rider, lined the processional path from the outer gates to the crimson throne. The flames inside them did not flicker. They roared. Rivers of controlled fire spilling over the rims and tracing channels cut into the stone floor so that anyone approaching the throne walked between lanes of burning light. 1,000 wolves had gathered, not civilians, warriors, veterans. Generals who had spent decades painting the borders of Vareth with enemy blood. They stood in the courtyard not because protocol required it, but because the Alpha King had summoned every ranked wolf in the Empire to witness the sacred bonding. The Mate Bond, the event that was supposed to cement the future of the most powerful bloodline the continent had ever produced. War banners snapped above them in the freezing wind. Each one bore the sigil of House Draxor, a black wolf devouring a crescent moon, stitched in silver thread that caught the eclipse light and turned it into something that looked like veins pulsing beneath cloth skin. At the summit of the courtyard, elevated on a platform of carved obsidian that required 40 steps to reach, sat the Crimson Throne. It was not beautiful. It was not meant to be. The throne had been forged from the melted weapons of 17 conquered kingdoms, fused together in a shape that suggested both a seat and a cage. The metal still held the ghost impressions of sword hilts and spear points, so that sitting upon it was never comfortable. That was the point. The founders of House Draxor believed a king should never feel at ease. Comfort bred softness. Softness bred collapse. And upon that throne sat Alpha King Vaelor Draxor. He was not a large man in the way peasants imagined kings to be. He was not 7 feet of raw muscle wrapped in golden armor. Vaelor was 6 feet and 2 inches of compressed violence. Every ounce of him was dense, carved from years of personal combat rather than ceremonial training. His jaw was sharp, but scarred along the left side where a rebel blade had caught him 3 years earlier during the Ashenveld suppression. He had killed the rebel with his bare hands after the cut. The scar remained because he refused the healers. He wanted the reminder. His eyes were the color of molten amber, and they held the warmth of a forge, which is to say they could shape things or they could burn things, and most people could not tell the difference until the damage was done. He wore no crown tonight. The Draxor kings never did during bonding ceremonies. Tradition dictated the king present himself as wolf first, monarch second. But the absence of a crown did nothing to diminish him. If anything, it made him more dangerous. A king without his symbols is just a man. And Vaelor had spent his entire reign proving that the man was more lethal than the title. His hands rested on the arms of the throne, fingers loose, posture deceptively relaxed. But every senior officer in the courtyard recognized the stillness for what it was. A predator at rest was still a predator. The muscles in his forearms were corded tight beneath the dark fabric of his ceremonial tunic. His breathing was slow, controlled. The breath of a man who had learned long ago that showing tension was the same as showing fear, and showing fear in Vareth was an invitation to bleed. General Herrick Voss stood 3 steps below the throne on the right, his gray beard trimmed close and his remaining eye fixed forward with the discipline of a man who had survived 40 years of imperial warfare by never looking surprised. He had served 3 Draxor kings. He had watched 2 of them die. He intended to watch nothing tonight except a ceremony. On the left stood Chancellor Maelor Sorn, Vaelor was the opposite of everything the military court valued. Thin, where warriors were broad. Smooth, where soldiers were scarred. His robes were immaculate, layered silk in shades of charcoal and deep wine, and his hands were always clasped behind his back in a posture that suggested patience, but concealed the fact that his fingers never stopped moving. He had the face of a scholar and the eyes of a merchant who had learned that information was worth more than gold, because gold could be stolen, but secrets could be sold repeatedly. He watched the crowd with a faint smile that never touched his eyes. Below the platform, at the base of the 40 steps, the processional path ended at a circle of silver embedded in the stone floor. The bonding circle. This was where the intended mate would stand to receive the king's acknowledgement and complete the sacred rite. The crowd shifted. A murmur began at the rear gates and rolled forward through the gathered wolves like wind moving through a field of dying grass. Heads turned, shoulders adjusted. A few of the younger officers craned their necks to see. She was walking, alone. No escort, no attendants, no family procession, which was itself a statement that several council members had already noted with the kind of quiet discomfort that precedes political maneuvering. In Vareth, a maid arrived surrounded by her bloodline. It was proof of worth, proof of alliance, proof that the union carried the weight of lineage behind it. Selene Vaelor had none of that. She walked the processional path between the rivers of fire in a simple gray dress that looked like it had been made for someone slightly larger than her. Her dark hair was pulled back from her face without decoration. No jewels, no paint on her lips, no silver threading her clothes. She was small, 5 feet and 4 inches at most, with narrow shoulders and a build that suggested she had spent more of her life hiding than fighting. She was 23 years old, and she looked like the kind of person the Empire forgot between meals. Her footsteps made almost no sound on the stone. This was the detail that unsettled the wolves more than anything. In a courtyard filled with predators whose hearing could detect a heartbeat across a crowded hall, Selene Vaelor moved in near silence. Not the trained silence of an assassin. Something else. Something that felt less like skill and more like absence, as though the world itself did not fully register her presence. She had no scent. A ripple of confusion passed through the ranks. Wolves relied on scent the way humans relied on sight. It was identity. It was rank. It was history, written in biological ink. Every wolf carried the markers of their bloodline, their emotional state, their power level, their health, layered into a chemical signature as unique as a fingerprint. Selene carried nothing. She smelled like clean air after snowfall. Empty. Neutral. As though someone had taken an eraser to her entire biological identity and left behind only the outline of a person. Several officers exchanged glances. A few of the older wolves frowned deeply. Herrick Voss shifted his weight almost imperceptibly. Only Maelor Sorn's expression did not change. His faint smile remained fixed like a painting. Selene reached the bonding circle and stopped. She looked up at the crimson throne, at the king seated above her. Her expression was difficult to read. Not blank, not terrified. Something closer to the face of a person who has been expecting pain for so long that its arrival feels more like confirmation than surprise. She said nothing. In the silence that followed, a brazier cracked and sent a shower of sparks into the frozen air. They drifted upward toward the eclipse like tiny orange souls ascending into a bleeding sky. Vaelor looked at her, and something moved behind his eyes. Something fast and involuntary, like a muscle spasm in a place you cannot reach to soothe. His wolf stirred, not gently. The beast inside the king did not nudge or whisper. It lunged against the walls of his control with a force that made Vaelor's fingers tighten on the throne's arms hard enough to whiten his knuckles. "Mine," the wolf said. The word was not language. It was pressure. Biological imperative compressed into a single syllable that resonated through every nerve ending in his body simultaneously. Vaelor's jaw clenched. No one below the platform could see the war happening inside him. They saw a king looking down at a small, scentless Omega who stood alone in a circle of silver and offered nothing that the court could measure or value. No political alliance, no military bloodline, no visible power. The silence stretched. General Herrick cleared his throat softly. A signal. The ceremony required the king to descend the steps, enter the bonding circle, and speak the words of acceptance. The eclipse was reaching its apex. Tradition demanded the bond be sealed beneath the full crimson light. Vaelor did not move. His wolf howled inside him. The sound was not audible to anyone else, but it rattled through Vaelor's chest cavity like a second heartbeat made of wire and need. Every cell in his body screamed to descend those steps, to close the distance, to bury his face against her throat and breathe in whatever ghost of scent lay hidden beneath that impossible neutrality. But Vaelor Draxor had not built an empire by obeying instinct. He had built it by crushing instinct beneath discipline and forging discipline into doctrine, and calling doctrine strength until the word became indistinguishable from identity. He stood. The courtyard fell silent with the abruptness of a door slamming shut. Vaelor descended 3 steps. Only 3. Enough to be heard clearly by every wolf present, but not enough to reach the bonding circle. Not enough to suggest equality. He stopped, and when he spoke, his voice carried the flat, measured weight of a judge delivering a sentence that has already been decided before the trial began. I refuse this bond. The words hit the courtyard like a physical blow. Several wolves flinched. A young officer near the front actually stepped backward as though the sentence had shoved him. Selene did not move. Her eyes stayed on the king. Her hands hung at her sides. Her breathing remained steady, but anyone close enough would have seen the faintest tremor move through her fingers like the last vibration of a struck bell. Vaelor continued. His voice was loud enough for the entire courtyard. Deliberate. This was not a private rejection spoken in whispered agony. This was theater. This was a king performing his convictions before his empire. I did not conquer 6 nations, he said, to kneel before a shadow. A king does not chain himself to weakness because the stars arranged it. I need a queen who can stand beside me on a battlefield and command slaughter with the same breath she uses to command loyalty. I need fire. I need steel. I need a wolf whose presence makes enemies choke on their own courage. Look at her. He gestured with one hand towards Selene, small, quiet, no scent, no lineage, no name worth remembering. The sacred bond is not law. It is suggestion, and kings do not take suggestions from the sky. And here's where a storyteller must pause and do what stories too often refuse to do. A storyteller must ask you to understand not the cruelty of the moment, but the machinery beneath it. Because Vaelor Draxor was not born cruel. Cruelty is a destination, not a birthplace. And the road that leads there is paved with something far more dangerous than malice. It is paved with logic that has never been challenged. Vaelor grew up inside a doctrine that equated vulnerability with extinction. His father, King Theron Draxor, had ruled through spectacle and punishment. His grandfather had erased an entire civilization to consolidate power. 3 generations of Draxor kings had survived by being the most terrifying thing in every room they entered. And the lesson that each generation passed to the next was not spoken in words. It was spoken in the silence of the things they never did. They never hesitated. They never softened. They never allowed anything that looked like tenderness to survive long enough to be witnessed. Vaelor had internalized this doctrine so completely that it had become invisible to him. He did not see it as ideology. He saw it as reality. The same way a man raised underwater does not question the existence of water. He simply breathes it. So when the mate bond ignited and his wolf screamed and his blood ran hot and every ancient instinct in his body pointed toward the small woman in the silver circle and said, "She is yours and you are hers," Vaelor did not feel love. He felt threat. And a man who perceives love as threat will always choose the weapon first. The silence after his declaration lasted 7 seconds. It felt like 7 years. Chancellor Mutlor Sorn was the first to move. He stepped forward, hands still clasped behind his back, and inclined his head with the precise angle of a man who has rehearsed sympathy the way an actor rehearses dying. "The king has spoken," Vaelor said. His voice was silk poured over broken glass. "The sacred bond is honored by its recognition, but wisdom demands more than destiny. Vareth requires strength. The throne requires certainty." He paused and let his eyes drift to Selene with an expression that combined pity and contempt in equal measure. "We thank the girl for her presence and wish her well in whatever life awaits her beyond the capital." That word, girl, not woman, not Omega, not even her name. Girl. It was calculated. Every word Maelor spoke was calculated. The Chancellor had spent 20 years learning that language was not communication. Language was architecture. You could build prisons with it. You could build graves. Selene's hands curled into fists at her sides. Not from anger, not yet. From the effort of keeping something inside her from responding. Because deep beneath the surface of Selene Vaelor, beneath the suppressed scent and the hidden bloodline and the years of careful invisibility, something had been listening to every word. Something ancient. Something patient. Something that had waited in the dark for exactly this moment, the way a seed waits in frozen ground for the first fracture of spring. She felt it stir. It moved through her like electricity through water, finding every nerve, every suppressed memory, every scar left by a childhood spent running from soldiers who hunted her blood. It pressed against the seals she had carved into her own flesh at the age of 9, blood wards drawn with a stolen knife and desperate instinct, seals that had hidden her true nature so completely that she had almost forgotten it herself. Almost. The eclipse above pulsed. Crimson light deepened across the courtyard, painting every surface in shades of old blood. General Herrick noticed it first. The light. It was wrong. Eclipse light was supposed to be uniform, a flat wash of red across the sky. But this light was moving, concentrating, pooling around the bonding circle like liquid being drawn toward a drain. Herrick opened his mouth to speak. Selene exhaled. And the seals broke. It did not happen all at once. It happened the way a dam breaks. First a crack, then a trickle, then a roar that made everything before it irrelevant. Silver fire erupted along the veins beneath Selene's skin, visible through her flesh like rivers of mercury lit from within. The gray dress shifted in a wind that touched nothing else. Her dark hair lifted from her shoulders, drifting upward as though gravity had become a suggestion rather than a law. The scentless void around her shattered. Her scent hit the courtyard like a tidal wave. It was not the warm biological signature of a wolf. It was something older, deeper, a scent that carried the weight of glaciers and the heat of volcanic glass and the sharp electric bite of lightning captured in a bottle and held for centuries. It was power compressed into olfactory form, and it bypassed the conscious mind entirely and struck the primal brain, the place where instinct lived before language was invented. Wolves stumbled. Armored veterans, men and women who had held formation against cavalry charges and siege fire and the screaming advance of berserker packs, stumbled backward like children who had walked into a room and found something they could not name staring back at them. Several officers dropped to one knee without deciding to. Their bodies simply obeyed. The silver light in Selene's veins intensified until she was less a person and more an outline filled with cold fire. On the platform, Vaelor's entire body locked. His wolf did not lunge this time. His wolf submitted. Inside Vaelor Draxor, the beast that had conquered armies, the predatory force that had never yielded to any living creature, went still and bowed its head and offered its throat. Vaelor felt his legs weaken. He caught himself on the edge of the throne and held on with both hands, jaw locked, tendons standing out in his neck like cables, every muscle in his body fighting against the biological imperative to kneel. His eyes were wide. For the first time in his reign, the Alpha King of Vaelor looked afraid. And Selene laughed. The sound was quiet, almost gentle. It was not the laugh of a villain or a warrior or a woman drunk on newly discovered power. It was the laugh of someone who has been carrying a weight so heavy and for so long that when it finally drops, the relief is indistinguishable from madness. She looked up at Vaelor, and her voice, when it came, was steady and clear and carried no tremor at all. "You rejected me because you saw weakness," she said. "But you did not see me. You saw what I allowed you to see. You saw the version of me that kept me alive while your empire hunted my bloodline to extinction. You saw the mask I wore so your soldiers would walk past me instead of through me." She paused. Her silver eyes, no longer brown, no longer human in color, caught the eclipse light and held it. "I am the last heir of the Eclipse Bloodline, the blood your grandfather burned, the name your father erased, the ghost your empire created when it decided that genocide was a valid political strategy." The courtyard was absolutely silent. Not the silence of reverence, the silence of 1,000 predators suddenly realizing they were standing in the presence of something that outranked every rank they had ever known. Maelor Sorn's smile vanished. For the first time in 20 years, the Chancellor's composure cracked. His clasped hands separated, his fingers twitched, his eyes darted to Vaelor, and then back to Selene, and then to the exits as his mind began running calculations at the speed of genuine fear. The Eclipse Bloodline. Dead. Extinct. Erased from every record and every archive and every memory. Maelor had personally overseen the final purges. He had burned the last of the documents himself and scattered the ashes into the ashen sea so that not even the wind could reassemble the truth. And yet here she stood, alive, awake, radiating a power that made the entire Draxer court feel like children playing at war. Here's the truth about buried things that powerful men refuse to learn. You can bury a body. You can bury a name. You can bury a history so deep that generations pass without a whisper of its existence. But you cannot bury blood. Blood remembers. Blood waits. Blood passes its memory from parent to child in a language older than civilization, and it does not care about politics or propaganda or the convenience of kings. Selene stepped out of the bonding circle, not toward the throne, away from it. She turned her back on the king. That single gesture contained more defiance than any army could have projected. In Vareth, turning your back on the Alpha King was not disrespect. It was a declaration that you did not consider him a threat. And in a culture built entirely on the currency of threat, that was the most devastating insult imaginable. Vaelor's voice broke through the silence. Stop. It was not a request. It was a command forged from a lifetime of issuing commands and having them obeyed without question. Selene did not stop. Vaelor descended 2 more steps. His voice hardened. His wolf clawed against the submission and found fury instead, the desperate fury of a creature that has glimpsed its own irrelevance and cannot accept it. I said, stop. You stand in my court, in my empire, under my sky. You do not walk away from the Crimson Throne. Selene paused. She looked back over her shoulder. Your sky, she said quietly. Your empire. Your court. Those are interesting words from a man sitting on a throne forged from the weapons of people he destroyed. How much of what you call yours was ever truly yours, Vaelor? Or did you simply inherit the theft and call it legacy? The words landed like arrows shot from a distance the king could not close. Vaelor's hands trembled, not from rage alone, from the specific agony of hearing a truth you have spent your entire life fortifying against. Because deep in the architecture of Vaelor's identity, in the place where conviction becomes indistinguishable from bone, a fracture appeared. Small, barely perceptible, but present. Like the first hairline crack in a dam that will not fully break for weeks but has already begun the process of collapse. Chancellor Maelor saw the fracture, and he moved. Seize her, Maelor commanded. His voice was sharp and immediate, cutting through the atmospheric weight of Selene's presence with the efficiency of a man who understood that awe was temporary, but chains were permanent. This woman is a deceiver. The Eclipse Bloodline is extinct. Whatever sorcery she wields is fabrication designed to destabilize the throne. Arrest her immediately. Take her to the black cells. Guards moved, or tried to. The first rank of soldiers stepped forward, weapons drawn, only to find that their legs would not carry them into the silver light radiating from Selene's body. They strained against it. Tendons stood out in their necks, boots scraped against stone. But the pressure rolling off her was not physical force. It was something older, something that spoke directly to the wolf inside each of them and said with absolute authority, "You do not touch her." Selene turned to face the approaching guards. She did not raise a hand. She did not bare her teeth. She simply looked at them, and her silver eyes held the weight of a bloodline that predated the empire itself, a lineage that had existed when Vareth was nothing but wilderness, and the wolves who would become kings were still learning to walk upright. The guards stopped. "Put your weapons down," one of them whispered to the soldier beside him. His face was pale. His sword arm shook. "I cannot tell you why, but put them down." Maelor's voice rose. He was shouting now, composure abandoned, the silk ripped away to reveal the iron underneath. "I gave an order. She is one woman. She is one wolf. You are the Imperial Guard of House Draxor. Move." A voice cut through the chaos from the East Colonnade. "They are not going to move, Chancellor." Every head turned. Commander Kalis Thorne stepped from the shadows of the colonnade with the unhurried stride of a man who had already decided where the evening was going to end. He was tall, lean, built for speed rather than spectacle, with the angular face of a hunter and eyes the color of wet slate that held the particular quality of intelligence that made politicians uncomfortable because it suggested he was always 3 steps ahead and had already dismissed the first 2. He wore the black armor of the Night Legion, the king's most feared military unit, and he wore it the way some men wear their own skin, without awareness, without adjustment, as though it had grown on him rather than been forged for him. A long sword hung at his left hip, a shorter blade at his right. Both hilts were wrapped in dark leather worn smooth by use. Kalis stopped at the edge of the courtyard and surveyed the scene with the calm assessment of a general reviewing a battlefield. He looked at the frozen guards, at the Chancellor's rising panic, at the king standing 5 steps above his throne with an expression that mixed fury and confusion in proportions that Kalis had never seen on that face before. And then he looked at Selene. Something passed between them. Not the mate bond, not the electric involuntary connection that had fired between Selene and Vaelor. This was different, quieter. The recognition of one survivor by another. The unspoken understanding that exists between people who have both stared into the dark and chosen to keep breathing not because life was good, but because dying felt like losing, and they were too stubborn to lose. They are not going to move, Kalis repeated, because their wolves will not let them. And a soldier whose wolf has chosen cannot be commanded by a man. Only by something greater. He looked at Vaelor. You are not something greater, Chancellor. Vaelor's eyes narrowed. You forget your rank, Commander. Kalis smiled. It was a thin smile. The kind of smile that decorated the face of a man who had spent years serving a system he understood was rotting and had finally found the moment where silence stopped being strategy and became complicity. I forget nothing, he said. That is the problem. He moved toward Selene, not aggressively, not protectively. He simply closed the distance between them with the purposeful stride of a man choosing a side and wanting everyone present to see him do it. He stopped beside her and turned to face the throne. 2 wolves, one ancient, one trained, standing together at the base of 40 steps and looking up at a king whose world was fracturing in real time. Vaelor stared down at them. His wolf howled. Not in submission now, not in fury, in something worse. Recognition. The recognition of a man who has spent his entire life building a fortress and realizes in a single, devastating instant that he built it facing the wrong direction. The enemy was never outside the walls. The enemy was the foundation itself. Vaelor opened his mouth, but Vaelor was faster. Kill them both, the Chancellor said. His voice was flat now. The panic was gone, replaced by something colder and more surgical. He had made his calculations. He had weighed the variables, and he had decided that whatever political fallout came from murdering the Night Legion commander and a woman claiming extinct royal blood was preferable to the alternative. The alternative was truth, and truth, Vaelor knew from 2 decades of Imperial service, was the one weapon that could not be reforged once it was broken. Archers, Vaelor said. High on the citadel walls, bowstrings creaked. Selene did not flinch. Kalis placed one hand on his sword hilt, and Vaelor, the Alpha King of Vaelor, the ruler of 6 conquered nations, the man who had never hesitated in his life, hesitated, because in that fraction of a second, looking down at the woman he had rejected and the soldier who had chosen her, something inside him whispered the question he had spent his entire reign refusing to hear. What if you're wrong? The question had no answer. Not yet, not tonight. But the fact that it existed at all meant the damage was done. Vaelor said nothing. His silence was the first crack in the foundation of the Crimson Throne, and Vaelor, ever the architect, saw that crack and understood. Fire, the Chancellor said. Arrows flew. Selene raised one hand. Silver light erupted from her palm like a wall of frozen lightning, catching every arrow in mid-flight and holding them suspended in the air for a single, terrible second before reducing them to ash that drifted down like gray snow. The courtyard gasped. Kalis drew his sword. Move, he said to Selene. Now! They ran, not toward the gates. The gates were sealed, not toward the walls. The walls were manned. They ran toward the eastern foundation, where the ancient waterways that predated the citadel by centuries cut beneath the obsidian foundations like veins beneath skin. Kalis knew the passages. He had mapped every weakness in the citadel years ago, not from disloyalty, but from the professional paranoia of a soldier who understood that any structure built to keep enemies out could also be used to trap the people inside. Behind them, the courtyard erupted into chaos. Soldiers shouted. Commanders screamed orders that contradicted each other. Vaelor's voice rose above the confusion like a blade cutting through noise, directing, commanding, orchestrating the response with the precision of a man who had been planning for contingencies his entire career. Vaelor stood on the steps and watched them disappear into the eastern shadows. He did not order pursuit. He did not issue a command. He stood there, alone on the steps of his own throne, while the eclipse painted him in light the color of everything he was about to lose. And somewhere beneath the chaos and the shouting and the running feet and the clash of steel, his wolf said one word. Mate. The word burned through him like a brand pressed against the inside of his chest. He closed his eyes. When he opened them, the shadows where Selene and Kalis had vanished were empty. The night swallowed them whole, and Vaelor Draxor, Alpha King of Vaelor, ruler of the Crimson Throne, conqueror of 6 nations, stood in the wreckage of his own ceremony and felt something he had not felt since he was a child watching his father execute a prisoner who had begged for mercy. He felt uncertain. The corridors beneath the citadel were older than memory. Kalis led the way with one hand trailing the damp stone wall and the other gripping a torch he had pulled from a rusted sconce. The flame was weak, guttering in the cold drafts that pushed through the tunnels like the breath of something sleeping deep underground. Water dripped from the low ceiling and collected in channels carved by centuries of patient erosion. Selene followed close behind. The silver light in her veins had dimmed to a faint glow, just enough to see by, just enough to remind both of them that what had happened in the courtyard was real and could not be taken back. She was shaking, not from fear. From the chemical aftermath of power she had not used in 14 years. Her body was adjusting to the broken seals like a muscle being stretched after years of atrophy. Every nerve ending buzzed, her vision pulsed between normal and something sharper, a predatory clarity that registered heat signatures and air currents and the micro-expressions on Kalis's face as he navigated the tunnels. "You knew," she said. Kalis did not slow down. "I suspected. That is not the same thing." "No," he agreed. "It is not. But suspicion kept you alive tonight. Certainty would have gotten us both killed sooner." The tunnel branched. Kalis took the left passage without hesitation, ducking beneath a stone arch carved with symbols so old the chisel marks had been worn smooth. "How long?" Selene asked. "How long have you suspected?" Kalis was quiet for several steps. 3 years, he said finally. "During the Ashenveld suppression. The king sent me to clear the northern ruins. I found records in the Foundation vaults. Old records. Records that should not have existed because they had supposedly been burned during the purges." He paused. "They described a bloodline that predated House Draxor, a bloodline tied to the lunar eclipses. The records called them the architects. Not of buildings, of balance. They were the ones who maintained the equilibrium between wolf bloodlines. They prevented any single house from accumulating too much power." He looked back at her. "Does that sound familiar?" Selene said nothing. Her silence was answer enough. They moved deeper into the tunnels. The walls changed. The rough-hewn stone gave way to something smoother, darker, carved with precision that suggested tools or techniques that modern Vaelor no longer possessed. The symbols on the walls shifted from worn abstractions to recognizable patterns. Lunar phases, eclipses, and a recurring motif of a wolf standing beneath a full moon with its head raised not in howling, but in silence. "You could have told the king," Selene said. Kalis laughed, short, bitter, without warmth. "I could have," he said, and he would have done one of two things: buried the records deeper, or buried me beside them. Vaelor does not want truth. He wants confirmation. There is a universe of difference between those two things, and it is the universe in which empires either evolve or collapse. They reached a junction where the tunnel widened into a small chamber. Water pooled on the floor, clear and cold, reflecting the faint silver glow from Selene's skin. Kalis extinguished the torch and leaned against the wall, breathing hard for the first time. He was wounded. Selene saw it now. A dark stain spreading beneath his left arm where a blade had caught him during their escape. Not deep enough to be fatal, deep enough to slow him. "You are bleeding," she said. "Yes. Sit down." "I am fine." "Sit down, Kalis." He looked at her. Something shifted in his expression. The assessment of a soldier being replaced, just for a moment, by something more human, something tired. He sat. Selene knelt beside him and pulled the armor aside to examine the wound. Her hands were steady despite the tremors running through the rest of her body. The cut was clean, 4 inches long, running along the ribs, muscle deep, bleeding steadily but not pulsing. No artery involvement. She pressed her palm against the wound. Silver light flared between her fingers, not the explosive courtyard-shaking power from before. This was different, precise, controlled, like the difference between a wildfire and a candle flame. The flesh beneath her hand warmed, knit, sealed. Kalis inhaled sharply through his teeth. When Selene pulled her hand away, the wound was closed. A thin silver scar remained, luminous against his skin like a thread of moonlight embedded in flesh. Kalis looked at the scar for a long time. "Thank you," he said. "We need to keep moving." "I know." He paused. "I want you to know something first. Whatever happens after tonight, whatever we find, wherever we are going, I did not choose your side because of what you are. I chose it because of what they are." He met her eyes. "The empire I served was built on a lie. I have known this for 3 years, and I have done nothing because doing nothing was easier than doing the right thing, and I am tired of easy." He stood. "So we move." They moved. Behind them, somewhere above the stone and the darkness and the centuries of buried history, the citadel was tearing itself apart. Orders and counter-orders cascaded through the military chain. Vaelor Sorn seized control of the communication networks and began broadcasting a narrative that would reach every corner of the empire before dawn. The narrative was simple. It was also a lie. A dangerous insurgent, the Chancellor declared, had infiltrated the bonding ceremony using forbidden sorcery. She had attacked the king. She had attempted to destroy the Crimson Throne. She had been aided by a traitor within the military. Commander Kalis Thorn, once trusted, had revealed himself as an agent of a foreign power seeking to destabilize Vareth. The Eclipse Bloodline was never mentioned, because mentioning it would require acknowledging that it had existed. And acknowledging that it had existed would require acknowledging what had been done to it. And acknowledging what had been done to it would require acknowledging that the foundation upon which House Draxer stood was not conquest. It was massacre. And massacre, unlike conquest, does not age into glory. It ages into guilt. Vaelor understood this better than anyone alive. He had built his career on the management of guilt, redirecting it, repackaging it, transforming it into something that looked like necessity, so that the men who carried it could sleep at night, and the empire that profited from it could call itself civilized. He stood in the communications chamber beneath the Hall of Crowns and dictated his lies with the calm efficiency of a surgeon operating on a patient he intended to let die. Vaelor entered the chamber 20 minutes later. He was alone. No guards. No generals. His ceremonial tunic was torn at the collar where he had pulled at it, and his amber eyes carried the specific brightness of a man whose internal architecture was under structural stress. "What are you doing?" Vaelor said. "Saving your throne," Vaelor replied without looking up. She called herself Eclipse. Yes, and she is either delusional or dangerous, and in both cases the response is the same. Contain, control, redirect. Vaelor moved closer. His voice dropped to something that was not a whisper, but carried the compressed intensity of a whisper. "What if she is telling the truth?" Vaelor stopped writing. He turned to face the king with an expression that combined patience and warning in proportions refined by 2 decades of practice. Then the Chancellor said carefully, "We have a much larger problem than one woman. Because if the Eclipse Bloodline survives, then everything your grandfather did was not the decisive stroke of a visionary king securing his dynasty. It was butchery. And if it was butchery, then the legitimacy of every Draxer king who came after, including you, is built on a grave." He paused. "Is that the conversation you want to have with your empire, your majesty?" Vaelor stood very still. The question was not rhetorical. It was a trap. and Vaelor was experienced enough to recognize it as one, but exhausted enough to feel its teeth closing around him anyway. "No," the king said. The word cost him something. He could feel it leaving, like heat escaping through a crack in a wall. Something vital, something he would spend weeks trying to name and years trying to recover. "Then we proceed as planned," Vaelor said. He turned back to his documents. "She is an insurgent. He is a traitor. The narrative is already moving. By morning, every wolf in Vareth will know the story we need them to know. And the truth, whatever it is, will be irrelevant." Vaelor said nothing. He turned and walked out of the chamber. The corridor was empty, dark. His footsteps echoed against stone that had witnessed the decisions of kings for 300 years. The walls did not judge. The walls did not remember. That was the comfort of stone. It absorbed everything and reflected nothing. But the king reflected, despite himself, despite every mechanism of discipline and doctrine that had been installed in him since childhood. The question that had appeared on the steps of the throne would not die. What if you are wrong? He walked until he reached the royal quarters. He pushed open the heavy door and stood in the darkness of his own room and felt the mate bond, severed and burning, pulse inside his chest like a second heart that refused to stop beating. He pressed his fist against his sternum. "Mate," his wolf whispered. "Shut up," the king said aloud to the empty room. But silence answered. And silence, Vaelor was beginning to learn, was not the absence of sound. It was the presence of everything you refused to say. Miles away, beneath a sky still stained by the fading eclipse, Selene and Kalis emerged from the tunnel network into the frozen wastelands beyond the capital. The cold hit them immediately. Brutal, personal. The kind of cold that did not attack the body so much as interrogate it, asking every exposed surface how badly it wanted to continue existing. Selene stood at the tunnel mouth and looked back toward the distant silhouette of the citadel. Its towers were black against the crimson sky, and the fires from the courtyard braziers were visible as tiny orange points, like the eyes of something watching her from very far away. She breathed in. The air tasted like iron and ice. 14 years, she said. I hid for 14 years. I forgot my own bloodline. I forgot my own name. I became so good at being invisible that I nearly disappeared entirely. She paused. And then a king who never bothered to look at me decided I was not enough. Kalis stood beside her. He said nothing. Sometimes silence was not absence. Sometimes it was the most generous thing one person could offer another. He was right, Selene said. I was not enough. Not for him. Not for the version of myself I had been performing. She turned from the citadel. But that version is dead now. She died in a circle of silver with an entire empire watching. She looked at Kalis. And whatever comes next, she said, will not be quiet. Kalis nodded. He adjusted his sword belt, checked the makeshift bandage beneath his armor, even though the wound was healed, and scanned the frozen landscape ahead of them with the automatic assessment of a man who viewed terrain as either advantage or threat and had no use for the word neutral. There is a fortress, he said, 3 days north, hidden in the glacier cliffs. The old texts called it the Hollow Sanctum. If any Eclipse records survived the purges, they survived there. And if the records are gone, then we improvise. Selene almost smiled. They walked into the wasteland. Behind them, the eclipse faded. The crimson drained from the sky like blood from a wound finally beginning to close. Stars appeared, cold, distant, indifferent to the affairs of wolves and kings and the empires they built from each other's bones. The night was vast. The road was long. And somewhere in the obsidian citadel, a king sat alone in the dark and pressed his fist against the place where a bond still burned and wondered if the greatest conquest of his life had not been the 6 nations he had claimed, but the single woman he had thrown away. He would not sleep that night. He would not sleep for many nights to come. Because rejection, he was discovering, was not an act. It was an echo. And echoes, unlike commands, do not obey the man who creates them. They simply repeat, and repeat, and repeat. In the Chancellor's chamber, Vaelor Sorn sealed the last of his dispatches and handed them to a courier with instructions that were brief and absolute. The courier disappeared into the night. Vaelor sat down at his desk. He opened a locked drawer and withdrew a small leather-bound journal that he had kept for 20 years, a journal that contained no official records and no state correspondence. Only observations, patterns, contingencies. He opened it to a fresh page, and he wrote a single line. The Eclipse lives. He studied the words for a long time. Then he closed the journal, locked the drawer, and extinguished the lamp. In the darkness, his eyes reflected nothing. But his mind was already building the cage. 3 days in the frozen waste stripped everything that was not necessary. Kalis did not talk much during the march. He moved with the mechanical efficiency of a man whose body had been trained to function on minimal sleep, minimal food, and maximal awareness. Every few hours he would stop, crouch, press his fingers to the ground, and read the terrain the way a scholar reads text. Vibrations, temperature shifts, the faint chemical traces left by animals, or more dangerously, by wolves on patrol. Selene watched him work and understood something she had never considered during her years of hiding. Survival was not a single skill, it was a language. And the fluency required to speak it under pressure was earned through repetition so brutal that most people broke before they became conversational. She was fluent in a different dialect. Hers was the survival of stillness, of making herself so small, so unremarkable, so scentless and silent that the world passed over her the way water passes over a stone too smooth to catch. For 14 years that dialect had kept her alive, but dialects have limits, and hers had reached its border the moment she stepped into the bonding circle and let the Empire see what she actually was. There was no going back to invisible. The wasteland around them was not empty. It was abandoned. The difference mattered. Empty meant nothing had ever lived there. Abandoned meant something had lived there and had been removed, and the scars of that removal were everywhere if you knew how to look. Kalis pointed to a ridge of black rock that cut across the ice field like a spine. "See those marks?" he said. Selene squinted. Along the ridge, at irregular intervals, the rock face bore deep vertical gouges. They were too uniform to be natural erosion and too large to be tool marks. "Claw marks," she said. Kalis shook his head. "Siege marks. Artillery. The Imperial Army used gravitational rams during the purges. They could crack a mountain from 2 miles away." He traced the line of gouges with his finger. This entire ridge was a defensive position. Whoever held it was dug in deep. The rams broke the fortifications, but the rock remembers the impact pattern. He looked at her. "Your people made their stand here." Selene stared at the marks. 14 years of hiding had insulated her from the physical evidence of what had been done. She had known the history intellectually. Her mother had whispered it to her in fragments before the soldiers came. But fragments were abstract. They lived in the mind as ideas, terrible but manageable, the way a person can know that fire burns without understanding the specific agony of being burned. These marks were not abstract. These marks were the places where her ancestors had stood against an empire and lost. "How many?" she asked. Kalis was quiet for a moment. "The historical records I found referenced a population of roughly 12,000 Eclipse wolves in the northern territories alone. After the purges, the imperial census listed 0. He paused. 12,000 people do not become 0 through warfare alone, Selene. Warfare leaves survivors, prisoners, refugees. 0 means something else. 0 is a policy decision. And here the story demands a pause. Because what Kalis described was not unique to this fictional empire. It was a pattern as old as power itself. Every civilization that has ever achieved dominance has faced the same temptation, the temptation to solve the problem of difference through elimination rather than accommodation. And every civilization that has surrendered to that temptation has discovered the same truth, eventually, at great cost. You cannot eliminate a people. You can eliminate their bodies, their cities, their records, their language and their customs, and every visible trace of their existence. But you cannot eliminate the fact that they existed. That fact persists in the negative space, in the ruins you cannot explain, in the histories that have holes where continuity should be, in the guilt that accumulates in the bones of the inheriting generation like a toxin that has no name and no antidote. Vareth had been living with that toxin for 3 generations, and Selene was its embodiment. They reached the glacier cliffs on the evening of the 3rd day. The hollow sanctum was not visible from the surface. It was buried beneath a cascade of ancient ice that had sealed its entrance centuries ago, either by natural accumulation or, as Kalis suspected, by deliberate engineering. Someone had wanted this place hidden. Not destroyed. Hidden. There was intention in the preservation. Kalis studied the ice face. The old text described a lunar gate, he said, an entrance that responded to Eclipse blood. He looked at Selene. I am assuming that means you. Selene stepped forward and placed her palm against the ice. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the silver light in her veins pulsed once, hard, like a heartbeat amplified through crystal, and the ice beneath her hand cracked. Not violently, precisely. Fractures radiated outward in geometric patterns, following lines that had been carved into the rock face behind the ice long before the glacier formed. The cracks widened, ice shifted. Sheets of frozen water slid away from the cliff face and shattered on the rocks below, revealing a doorway cut from black stone. The entrance was 15 feet tall and shaped like a pointed arch. The stone around it was carved with the same lunar symbols they had seen in the tunnels beneath the citadel, but these were intact, unweathered. Protected by the ice for centuries, they retained the sharp edges and deep grooves of their original creation. Above the arch, carved in letters that Selene could read without understanding how she knew the language, were two words. Remember, return. She stood in front of those words for a long time. Kalis waited. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick. Not with tears, with something heavier. My mother said those words to me, Selene said, the night the soldiers came. She put me in a cellar beneath the kitchen floor and sealed it with her own blood. I could hear them breaking down the door above me. I could hear her voice. She was not begging, she was not screaming, she was repeating those two words over and over while they dragged her out. Remember, return. She pressed her forehead against the stone. I forgot, she whispered. For 14 years. I forgot her voice. I forgot the words. I forgot everything except the sound of the door and the silence after. She pulled back. Her eyes were dry in the way that goes past tears into something harder, something that has cauterized itself. I will not forget again. They entered the sanctum. The interior was vast, chambers carved from the living rock of the cliff, interconnected by corridors that spiraled downward into the earth like the interior of a nautilus shell. The air was cold but not stale. Ventilation channels, invisible but functional, maintained a constant circulation that suggested engineering far more sophisticated than anything in the imperial capital. And the walls were covered in records. Not books, not scrolls. The Eclipse Bloodline had recorded their history directly into stone. Carved text, diagrams, lineage charts, maps, treaties, scientific observations, and detailed accounts of their interactions with every wolf dynasty on the continent, all etched into the black rock with the same precise technique that had created the entrance arch. Kalis raised his torch, and the flame caught the carved surfaces and threw the text into sharp relief. Thousands of words, tens of thousands. Enough history to fill a library, preserved in a medium that fire could not burn and water could not dissolve. This is why they sealed it, Kalis said quietly. Paper burns. Stone does not. Selene moved through the chambers in silence. She read the walls, and the walls told her everything. The Eclipse Bloodline had not been a rival dynasty. They had been a regulatory body, a lineage whose biological gift, the silver fire, the lunar attunement, the ability to suppress or amplify the power of other wolf bloodlines, had made them the natural arbitrators of interclan conflict for centuries. They did not rule. They balanced. When one house grew too powerful, the Eclipse wolves adjusted. When famine or plague destabilized a region, they intervened. They were the immune system of a civilization, and they had performed that function quietly and effectively for longer than any single dynasty had existed. House Draxor had risen during a period of Eclipse decline. A plague had reduced the Eclipse population by half, and in that window of weakened oversight, the Draxor wolves had consolidated military power faster than any house before them. By the time the Eclipse recovered, the balance had shifted irreversibly. And then came King Aldrich Draxor, Vaelor's grandfather. Aldrich had understood something that made him more dangerous than any purely violent ruler. He understood narrative. He understood that power was not sustained by force alone, but by the story that justified force. And the Eclipse Bloodline, by their very existence, contradicted his story. His story was that House Draxor ruled because they were the strongest. The Eclipse Bloodline proved that strength without balance was just a slower form of collapse. So Aldrich eliminated them, not in a war, A war would have required justification. A war would have created records and witnesses and the possibility of sympathy. He eliminated them in silence. The purges were conducted at night, in remote territories, by units that reported directly to the throne and kept no written orders. Villages were surrounded, populations were removed, structures were burned to foundations, and the ground was salted so that nothing would grow to mark where people had lived. The operation took 3 years. When it was complete, Aldrich commissioned a new imperial history that made no mention of the Eclipse Bloodline at all. He did not even bother to vilify them. He simply erased them, as though 12,000 people had never existed. And this is the most dangerous thing a powerful institution can do, not persecution. Persecution creates martyrs, not war. War creates veterans who remember. Erasure creates nothing. It removes the possibility of memory itself. It says not only did this people not matter, but they were never here. It is the ultimate act of contempt, and it is always, always temporary. Because stone remembers what paper forgets. Selene read the final chamber. It contained a single wall of text, a letter, written by the last Eclipse elder before the sanctum was sealed. The letter was addressed to whoever came next. It said, "You are reading this because you survived. Survival is not enough. You know this. If survival were enough, you would not be here. You would be hidden. You would be safe. You would be invisible. But you came here instead, which means the hiding has become heavier than the truth, and the truth, however terrible, has become the only path that does not lead to slow disappearance. So here's what we leave you. Not weapons, not armies, not vengeance. We leave you the record, the complete, unedited, unburned record of what was done and who did it and why. Use it, not to destroy, to restore. Because the opposite of erasure is not revenge. The opposite of erasure is memory, and memory, carried forward with precision and courage, is the most dangerous thing an empire built on forgetting will ever face. Selene placed her hand on the wall. The stone was cold beneath her fingers. She stood there for a long time. When she turned to Kalis, her face had changed. The uncertainty was gone. The tremor in her hands was gone. The last residue of the girl who had hidden for 14 years, the Omega who made herself small and scentless and forgettable, evaporated like frost in the first light of a cold morning. What remained was something quieter than fury and harder than grief. What remained was decision. "I'm going back," she said. Kalis studied her face. He did not ask if she was sure. The question would have been an insult to what was standing in front of him. "What is the objective?" he asked. "The objective is the record. Every wall in this sanctum, every name, every date, every detail of what House Draxor did and how they did it. I want it documented, transcribed, made portable, and then I want it delivered to every territory in Vareth, every city, every outpost, every wolf who has ever looked at the Crimson Throne and believed the lie that it was built on glory instead of graves." Kalis was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That is not a rebellion. That is an information war." "Yes," Selene said, "it is." He nodded slowly, the kind of nod that meant he was running tactical calculations behind his eyes and finding the numbers surprisingly workable. "It will take time," he said, "weeks to transcribe, longer to distribute. And the moment Vaelor catches wind of what we are doing, he will send everything he has. Then we need to be finished before he catches wind. The Empire has spies in every territory. Then we need allies in every territory." Kalis looked at her. "You are talking about a network, intelligence, logistics, safe houses, couriers. That is not built in weeks. That is built in months. Then we start tonight." And something shifted between them in that moment. Not the dramatic electric shift of a mate bond firing or a battlefield alliance forged under arrows. Something smaller, quieter. The shift that happens when two people who have been operating independently suddenly align, and the alignment creates something that neither of them could generate alone. Purpose. Not the grand theatrical purpose of kings making speeches on elevated platforms. The unglamorous operational purpose of people who have decided that something must change and have accepted that the cost of changing it will be personal and steep and non-negotiable. Selene looked at the carved walls one last time. Then she picked up a blank journal from a supply cache in the corner of the chamber, opened it, and began to write. While Selene transcribed the stone records in the frozen silence of the hollow sanctum, the capital of Vareth was consuming itself. Chancellor Vaelor Sorn did not waste a single hour. The morning after the ceremony, before the courtyard blood had been fully scrubbed from the stone, he convened an emergency session of the Royal Council. The council chamber sat in the heart of the citadel, a circular room with tiered seating carved from obsidian and a domed ceiling painted with the conquests of House Draxor. Generals and ministers filed in with the specific tension of men who had been woken before dawn and told that the empire was under threat. Vaelor sat at the head of the council table. He had not slept. His eyes carried the bruised, hollow quality of a man who had spent the night wrestling with something that had no physical form and therefore could not be pinned or defeated. His ceremonial attire had been replaced by simple military dress: black tunic, black trousers, no insignia. He looked less like a king and more like a soldier awaiting orders, which was itself a warning sign that only the most observant council members registered. Vaelor stood at the center of the chamber and addressed the room with the calibrated urgency of a man who understood that panic was a tool, and like all tools, was most effective when applied with precision. "Gentlemen," Vaelor began, "last night the Empire suffered an attack, not from a foreign power, not from a border rebellion, from within. A woman identifying herself as a descendant of a long-extinct bloodline infiltrated the bonding ceremony, assaulted the king with forbidden sorcery, and escaped with the assistance of Commander Kalis Thorn, who has revealed himself as a traitor to the throne." The room stirred. General Herrick Voss, seated to Vaelor's right, leaned forward. He had served the Empire long enough to recognize propaganda when it was being constructed in front of him. His one remaining eye fixed on Vaelor with the steady attention of a man who intended to remember every word spoken in this room. "Assaulted," Herrick said. The word landed flat. Hard. "That is an interesting characterization, Chancellor. I was present. I saw no assault. I saw a woman reveal a power that made every wolf in the courtyard, including myself, take a step backward. That is not assault. That is presence." Vaelor did not flinch. Uncontrolled release of suppressive aura within the imperial court constitutes an act of aggression under Article 7 of the Sovereign Protection Statutes. The legal framework is clear. "The legal framework," Herrick said slowly, "was written by your office 12 years ago, during the judicial reforms that you personally authored." He paused. "I remember because I voted against them." Vaelor smiled. "And your objection was noted and overruled. The statutes stand." He turned to the broader council. "The immediate concern is not legal classification. It is security. The woman demonstrated power of a magnitude we have not seen in 3 generations. If she is what she claims, and I want to be clear that we have no verified evidence of that claim, then she represents an existential threat to the continuity of House Draxor's rule." A younger minister near the back of the chamber raised his hand. Councillor Draven, a man whose ambition outpaced his experience by a ratio that Vaelor found useful. "Chancellor, what exactly is the Eclipse Bloodline?" "I have never encountered the term in any historical record." Vaelor nodded as though the question were perfectly reasonable, rather than perfectly engineered, because it does not exist in any historical record. The term refers to a myth, a folk legend from the pre-imperial era, a supposed lineage of wolves with lunar-derived abilities who served as, and here he paused with the precise timing of an actor delivering the word that reframes the entire scene, arbitrators. Self-appointed judges of interclan affairs who believed their blood gave them the right to regulate the power of sovereign houses. He let the word regulate hang in the air. In a room full of men whose power depended on deregulation, the word performed exactly as intended. "She wants to control us," Councillor Draven said. It was not a question. His voice carried the offended certainty of a man who had just been told that someone wanted to take something he considered his. "The mythology supports that interpretation," Vaelor confirmed. Vaelor had not spoken. He sat at the head of the table with his hands flat on the surface and his eyes fixed on a point in the middle distance that corresponded to nothing in the physical room. His breathing was steady. Too steady. The deliberate steadiness of a man who was controlling his respiration because controlling anything else had become temporarily impossible. His wolf was silent. This was new. Since the ceremony, the beast inside him had cycled between fury and submission and desperate clawing need. But now it was quiet, watching, as though it had decided that the situation required observation rather than reaction, and had temporarily ceded control to the human mind, which was itself not entirely sure it wanted the responsibility. "Your Majesty," Vaelor said, directing the room's attention to the king with the practiced gesture of a conductor cueing an instrument. "Your guidance on the military response." Vaelor's eyes refocused. He looked at Vaelor, and in that look, something happened that Vaelor did not expect. The Chancellor had spent 20 years reading Vaelor Draxor's face. He had catalogued every micro-expression, every tension pattern, every shifting ratio of confidence to doubt. He had built his entire political strategy around his ability to predict what the king would feel before the king himself knew. But this expression was new. It was not anger, it was not confusion, it was not the desperate uncertainty of the night before. It was suspicion. "How long have you known?" Vaelor said. The council chamber went still. "Known what, Your Majesty?" Vaelor replied. His voice did not change, his posture did not shift, but somewhere behind his eyes, a door closed. "About the Eclipse Bloodline," Vaelor said. "You called it a myth, a folk legend. But you had the legal framework for suppressive aura attacks already written and ratified 12 years ago. You classified a specific type of power as criminal before anyone in this room had ever witnessed it." He leaned forward. "You do not write laws against myths, Chancellor. You write laws against things you know are real." The silence that followed was the kind that decides the future. Vaelor held Vaelor's gaze for 3 full seconds. Then he smiled. It was the worst smile Herrick Voss had ever seen on a human face. Not because it was cruel, because it was honest. For the first time in 2 decades of political performance, Vaelor Sorn allowed the mask to slip just far enough for the man behind it to be visible. And the man behind it was not an advisor or a servant or a loyal chancellor. The man behind it was an architect, and the building he had been constructing for 20 years was not the empire. It was the cage around the king. "You are smarter than your father," Vaelor said softly. Theron never asked that question. He simply obeyed. He paused. "Your grandfather would have asked, but your grandfather would also have had me killed before I could answer. You are somewhere in between, Vaelor, and that in between is exactly where I need you." "Guards," Vaelor said. No one moved. Vaelor turned his head slowly toward the soldiers stationed at the chamber doors. They stood at attention, eyes forward, weapons at rest, perfectly disciplined, perfectly still, perfectly loyal to the man who signed their pay. And for the past 12 years, that man had not been the king. Vaelor clasped his hands behind his back. "The chamber is sealed, Your Majesty. Not against you. For you. The decisions we make in this room will determine whether House Draxor survives the next 30 days or joins the Eclipse Bloodline in extinction. I am not your enemy. I am the only man in this empire who understands the actual threat. And the actual threat is not one woman with silver fire in her veins. The actual threat is the truth she carries. And truth, unlike armies, cannot be defeated in the field. It can only be managed." Vaelor stood. The chair scraped against stone. Every head in the room turned. The king was not large. But in that moment, standing at the head of a table surrounded by men who had just revealed themselves as either compromised or complicit, Vaelor Draxor filled the room in a way that had nothing to do with physical size. His wolf woke up, not the confused, submissive creature that had bowed before Selene's power, not the howling, desperate animal that had clawed at the severed bond through sleepless hours. This was the wolf that had conquered 6 nations, the wolf that had walked onto battlefields where the odds were calculated against him and recalculated the odds with his teeth. Vaelor looked at Vaelor. "You have managed me," the king said. His voice was very quiet, very controlled. The control of a man who has realized that the louder he speaks, the less power he actually projects. "For 20 years, since I was a boy, you managed my father before me. You have shaped every doctrine I believed was my own, every policy I thought I chose, every instinct I thought was natural." Vaelor said nothing. "I rejected my mate," Vaelor continued. "In front of 1,000 wolves, I stood on the steps of my own throne and threw away the bond because I believed that vulnerability was weakness and weakness was death." He paused. Where did I learn that, Chancellor? The question filled the room like smoke. Vaelor's expression did not change, but his fingers, hidden behind his back, stopped moving. You learned it from the world, Vaelor said carefully. No, Vaelor said. I learned it from you. You built the world I lived in, and I let you. Because letting you was easier than thinking for myself, and thinking for myself would have required me to look at the foundations of this empire and ask what they were made of. He stepped away from the table. I know what they are made of now. He walked toward the door. The guards shifted. Hands moved toward weapons. Eyes darted to Vaelor. Let him go, Vaelor said. The guards parted. Vaelor walked through the door without looking back. The corridor swallowed him. In the council chamber, Vaelor stood very still for 10 seconds. Then he turned to the assembled ministers. The king is compromised, he said. His voice carried no emotion, no regret, no triumph, only the flat administrative efficiency of a man transitioning from one phase of a plan to the next. The mate bond has destabilized his judgment. For the security of the empire, executive authority transfers to the council under Emergency Provision 9 until such time as the king demonstrates fitness to rule. Herrick Voss stood. That provision requires a majority vote. Vaelor looked at him. He looked at the faces around the table. Ministers he had appointed. Generals he had promoted. Officials whose careers existed because Vaelor Sorn had decided they should exist. Then we vote, Vaelor said. The vote took 4 minutes. It passed 11-3. Herrick Voss was one of the 3. The old general collected his things, stood, and walked toward the door. As he passed Vaelor, he stopped. You will not survive this, Herrick said quietly. Vaelor smiled. History is written by survivors, General, and I intend to be holding the pen. Herrick left without another word. By nightfall, Chancellor Vaelor Sorn controlled the Imperial Army, the Treasury, the communications network, and the legal apparatus of Vareth. The king was confined to the royal quarters under the polite fiction of medical observation. Dispatches bearing Vaelor's seal raced toward every border outpost and territorial governor. The dispatches contained 2 directives. First, the woman calling herself Selene Vaelor was declared an enemy of the state. Any wolf providing her shelter, information, or assistance would be executed alongside their entire bloodline. Second, Commander Kalis Thorn was stripped of rank and declared a traitor. His Knight Legion, the most feared military unit in the Empire, was ordered to disband immediately and report to the capital for reassignment. The Knight Legion did not comply. 1,200 soldiers stationed across the northern territories received the order and did something that had not happened in the 300-year history of House Draxer's military. They refused. Not loudly, not with declarations or defiance. They simply did not move. They remained at their posts. They maintained their patrols. They continued their duties as though the order had never arrived. Because the Knight Legion did not serve the Chancellor, they did not even serve the king. They served Kalis Thorn, and Kalis Thorn had taught them something that no other commanding officer in Vareth had ever considered worth teaching. He had taught them to think. In the frozen chambers of the hollow sanctum, Selene finished transcribing the last wall. She closed the journal. Her hands were cramped. Her fingers were stained with ink that had frozen and thawed, and frozen again in the glacial air. She had not slept in 2 days. Her body ached with the deep structural fatigue of a person who has been running on purpose instead of rest, and is approaching the point where purpose alone is no longer sufficient fuel. Kalis entered the chamber carrying dried rations and a water skin. He looked at the journal in her hands. "Done," he asked. "Done," she said. He sat across from her. The torch between them threw their shadows against the carved walls, elongating them into dark shapes that flickered like ghosts arguing. "I need to tell you something," Kalis said. Selene looked at him. His face was difficult to read, not because it was blank, but because it contained too many things simultaneously, concern and calculation, and something softer that he was clearly uncomfortable with and was managing by pretending it did not exist. "The Knight Legion has gone silent," he said. "No response to Imperial dispatches, no acknowledgement of the disbandment order. That means they are waiting for instructions from me." "Good," Selene said. "It is not good. It means Vaelor knows exactly where they are, and if they are not obeying his orders, he will send forces to compel them. Which means I need to reach them before he does. He paused. Which means I need to leave. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of things neither of them said. Selene looked at the journal, at the walls, at the man sitting across from her who had abandoned his career, his rank, his safety, and the only life he had ever known because he believed that the truth mattered more than comfort. "Come back," she said. Kalis stood. He adjusted his sword belt, checked his armor, ran his hand once through his hair in a gesture so unconscious and so human that it cracked something inside Selene she had not known was still intact. He crossed the chamber to the doorway. Then he stopped. He turned back. "The scars on your bloodline," he said. "The ones the Empire carved. They did not make you weaker." He paused. "They made you the only person in Vareth who understands what power actually costs. And that understanding is worth more than every sword in the Night Legion." He left. His footsteps faded down the corridor. Selene sat alone in the frozen chamber, surrounded by the carved testimony of 12,000 ghosts. She opened the journal again, and on the first blank page after the transcribed records, she began writing something new. Not history, strategy. Because memory without action is monument. And she was not building a monument, she was building a war. In the royal quarters of the Obsidian Citadel, behind a locked door guarded by soldiers who answered to a chancellor instead of a king, Vaelor Draxor pressed his back against the cold wall and slid down until he was sitting on the floor. His wolf paced inside him. "Mate," it whispered. "Mate," it repeated. "Mate," it would not stop saying. Vaelor closed his eyes. And for the first time since he was 7 years old, watching his father execute a man who had done nothing except ask for mercy, the Alpha King of Vareth allowed himself to feel the full weight of what he had done. The bond burned in his chest. Not with warmth, with the specific surgical pain of something that should have been whole and was now severed, a phantom limb of the soul, an absence so present it had its own gravity, pulling everything inside him toward a center that no longer existed. He pressed both hands against his sternum. She was out there. Somewhere in the frozen waste beyond the capital, the woman he had rejected was carrying the truth that could destroy his entire bloodline's legacy. And the man he had trusted most in the world was sitting in his seat, commanding his army, spending his treasury, and dismantling everything Vaelor had built. And the worst part, the part that made the king press his forehead against his knees and breathe through his teeth, like a man fighting the urge to scream. The worst part was that he deserved it, all of it. Every consequence now descending upon him was the direct result of choices he had made freely. Choices shaped by a doctrine he had never questioned because questioning it would have required courage, and courage, real courage, was not the willingness to fight. It was the willingness to be wrong. And Vaelor Draxor had never in his life been willing to be wrong. Until now. He raised his head. He looked at the locked door, and behind his amber eyes, something ignited. Not the cold fire of the wolf, not the desperate burn of the severed bond. Something older. Something that belonged not to the beast or to the king, but to the man beneath both titles. The same stubbornness that had conquered 6 nations. The same relentless, grinding, unsurrenderable force that had carried him through battles he should have lost and negotiations he should have failed, and moments where lesser men would have accepted defeat as permanent. He stood up. He walked to the door. He placed his palm flat against the wood. And behind that door in the corridor beyond, 2 guards, who had been told the king was under medical observation, heard a sound that made both of them take an involuntary step backward. The sound of a wolf, not a howl, a growl, low, sustained, vibrating through the wood and the stone and the air itself with a frequency that bypassed the ears and spoke directly to the spine. The growl of an alpha who had stopped negotiating with his cage. The door cracked. Not opened. Cracked. Splinters erupted outward. And the 2 guards, veterans both, men who had faced enemy charges without flinching, looked at each other and understood with perfect clarity that the thing on the other side of that door was no longer a confined king. It was a consequence. And consequences, unlike kings, do not wait for permission. The door exploded outward. Splinters the size of daggers embedded themselves in the corridor walls. The iron hinges, forged to withstand siege-grade impact, tore from the stone frame and skittered across the floor like broken teeth. The two guards were thrown backward. One hit the far wall and crumpled. The other rolled, recovered, and drew his sword on pure instinct before his conscious mind registered what was standing in the doorway. Vaelor stepped through the ruined frame. He was barefoot. His tunic was torn at the sleeves where the muscles of his forearms had expanded during the partial shift, veins standing rigid beneath skin that had darkened with the flush of wolf blood running hot. His eyes were no longer amber. They burned a deep, molten gold that cast faint light against the corridor stone. The marker of an alpha whose wolf had not merely surfaced but fused, that rare and dangerous state where the line between man and beast dissolved entirely, and what remained was something that operated with the intelligence of one and the lethality of the other. The standing guard held his position. His sword trembled. "Your Majesty," the guard said. His voice cracked on the second word. "My orders are to maintain this post." Vaelor looked at him. He did not speak. He did not growl. He simply directed the full weight of his alpha presence at a single soldier from a distance of 4 feet, and the soldier's wolf, buried deep inside the man's chest where duty and training had pushed it into a small, obedient corner, answered. The guard's knees buckled. He fought it. Credit to the man, he fought it for almost 3 full seconds, jaw locked, tendons straining, sweat breaking across his forehead in the cold corridor air. But 3 seconds against a fully fused Alpha King was 3 seconds more than most wolves had ever managed. The guard knelt. His sword clattered to the stone. Vaelor stepped past him without a word. The Citadel corridors were designed for ceremony, not speed. They wound through the structure in deliberate spirals, forcing visitors to pass through layers of increasing grandeur before reaching the heart of power. Vaelor ignored the ceremonial route. He moved through service passages and maintenance corridors that he had memorized as a boy during the years when the palace had been more prison than home, and mapping escape routes had been the only form of control available to a child whose father regarded curiosity as disobedience. He reached the armory in 6 minutes. It was unguarded. Vaelor had pulled every available soldier to the outer perimeters and the communication hubs, the strategic points that mattered for controlling information flow. The armory was irrelevant to a chancellor who understood that in the modern empire, the most dangerous weapons were not swords, they were narratives. But Vaelor was not fighting a narrative war. Not yet. He armed himself with brutal efficiency. A short sword, balanced for close-quarters combat, the kind of blade designed for corridors and tight spaces where reach mattered less than speed. A combat knife strapped to his left forearm. Light armor, leather and chain, that covered the torso without restricting movement. No helmet. Helmets limited peripheral vision, and a wolf whose senses were fully engaged needed every degree of awareness the body could provide. He moved toward the eastern gate. And here the story must pause to examine something that most narratives about kings and warriors conveniently ignore. The internal cost of clarity arriving late. Vaelor Draxor was not stupid. He had never been stupid. He was in fact exceptionally intelligent, a strategic mind capable of processing multiple variables simultaneously and arriving at optimal decisions under extreme pressure. This intelligence had won him 6 wars and a continent. But intelligence and wisdom are not the same organ. Intelligence is the ability to solve problems. Wisdom is the ability to identify which problems are worth solving, and more critically, which problems you yourself have created. Intelligence can be trained, wisdom can only be earned, and the tuition is always paid in loss. Vaelor was paying now. Every step through the corridors of his own palace was a step through the architecture of his failure. He passed the Hall of Crowns, where he had made policy with a chancellor who had been engineering his isolation for 2 decades. He passed the war room, where he had planned campaigns using intelligence filtered through Vaelor's apparatus. Intelligence that now seemed less like information and more like grooming. He passed the private study where he had sat with Vaelor 1,000 evenings, drinking imported wine and discussing strategy, and never once, not once in 20 years, had he stopped to ask why the chancellor's advice always led to the same conclusion. More control, more force, more isolation. The doctrine of fear that Vaelor had believed was his own philosophy, the conviction that vulnerability equaled extinction, had never been his. It had been installed, carefully, patiently, over decades. The way a gardener trains a vine to grow in a specific direction by cutting away every branch that reaches toward the light. Vaelor had been cutting Vaelor's branches since the boy was 8 years old, and the boy had grown into a king who thought the shape he occupied was natural. This is the cruelest form of manipulation, not the kind that forces compliance through obvious threat, the kind that shapes the target's identity so thoroughly that the target defends the manipulation as self-expression. The cage becomes the skeleton. Remove it, and the creature does not know how to stand. Vaelor knew how to stand, but he was learning, with every step, that standing in a shape someone else designed was not the same as standing on your own. He reached the eastern gate. It was locked, sealed by Vaelor's order. Heavy iron bars crossed the doors in an X pattern, bolted into the stone frame with pins that required a specific key held by the captain of the gate watch. The captain of the gate watch was a man named Relin Marsh, 42 years old, career soldier, competent, unremarkable, the kind of man who survived in institutional hierarchies by never making decisions important enough to be noticed. Relin stood in front of the sealed gate with 4 soldiers and the expression of a man who deeply wished he had chosen a different career. "Your Majesty," Relin said. "Open the gate," Vaelor said. "I cannot." "Chancellor's orders. The citadel is under security lockdown. The Chancellor does not command gates." "The king commands gates." Relin swallowed. "Your Majesty, with respect. The council voted. Executive authority has been transferred. I have the documentation." Vaelor studied the man's face. Relin was afraid. Not of the king, not of punishment. He was afraid of the specific suffocating terror of a man caught between 2 competing authorities who both have the power to destroy him and neither of whom will remember his name regardless of which side he chooses. "Relin," Vaelor said. His voice dropped, not to a whisper, to something lower, something that vibrated in the register where wolves communicated beneath human language. "How long have you served?" 17 years, Your Majesty. 17 years. And in those 17 years, who signed your commission? Who promoted you from foot soldier to gate captain? Who stood in the rain at the Ashenveld front and told every man in the line that they would see their families again, and then made it happen? Relin's jaw tightened. And who, Vaelor continued, has never once visited a gatepost, never learned your name, never looked at you as anything other than a mechanism in a machine he intends to discard the moment it stops being useful. The corridor was silent except for the distant sound of boots on stone somewhere deeper in the citadel. Vaelor's patrols. Relin looked at the king, then he looked at the gate, then he reached for the key on his belt. The 4 soldiers behind him shifted. One of them placed a hand on Relin's arm. "Captain," the soldier said, "if we open that gate, we are finished. Court-martial, execution. Our families will be stripped of pension and housing." Relin stopped. The soldier was right. Vaelor would not merely punish them, he would erase them. Their names would be struck from military records. Their families would be relocated to the border territories where life expectancy was measured in seasons rather than years. The Chancellor's retribution was never dramatic. It was administrative, bureaucratic, so thorough and so quiet that by the time anyone noticed the damage, the victims had already been absorbed into the system's blind spots. Vaelor saw the calculation happening behind Relin's eyes, and he did something he had never done before. He told the truth without strategic purpose. "You're right," Vaelor said. He was looking at the soldier who had spoken. "Everything you said is correct. If you open this gate, Vaelor will come for you. He will come for your families. He will use every tool at his disposal to ensure that the cost of this decision follows you for the rest of your life." He paused. "I cannot protect you from that. I am a king without a throne, standing barefoot in my own palace, asking a gate captain to commit what the current authority will classify as treason. I have no leverage. I have no promises. I have nothing to offer you except the truth, which is that the man running this empire right now is a man who has spent 20 years building a cage around me and is now building one around you, and the only difference between his cage and mine is that I can see the bars." He stopped. The corridor held its breath. The soldier removed his hand from Relin's arm. Relin turned the key. The iron bars retracted with a grinding screech that echoed through the eastern wing like the sound of something old and heavy finally being moved. Vaelor walked through the gate. He did not thank them. Not because he was ungrateful, because thanking them would have diminished what they did. Gratitude implied they had done him a favor. They had not done him a favor. They had made a choice, and choices made at personal cost deserve recognition, not thanks. He disappeared into the night. Behind him, Relin Marsh closed the gate, replaced the bars, and stood in the corridor with 4 soldiers who had just ended their careers. Nobody said anything for a long time. Then the soldier who had spoken, the one who had laid out the consequences with such precision, sat down against the wall and let out a long, slow breath. "Well," the soldier said, "that is going to be a problem." Relin almost smiled. "Yes," the captain said, "it is." Vaelor ran, not toward the wastelands, not toward Selene. His wolf screamed at him to go north. Every fiber of the bond, severed and burning and relentless, pulled him toward the frozen cliffs where the woman he had rejected was building a war from stone records and stolen courage. The instinct was so powerful that his body physically resisted the direction he chose, muscles fighting intent, biology warring with decision. He went south, toward the Night Legion's nearest garrison. Because Vaelor Draxor, for all his failures and all his blind spots and all the years he had spent mistaking manipulation for wisdom, understood one thing with absolute clarity. He could not fix what he had broken by chasing the woman he had wronged. Selene did not need him. Selene had Kalis. Selene had the records. Selene had purpose and direction and the kind of moral certainty that comes from being on the right side of a historical atrocity. What Selene needed was time. And the only way to buy her time was to draw Maelor's attention south, away from the hollow sanctum, away from the truth, toward a king running through the dark with nothing but a short sword, and the slowly crystallizing understanding that sacrifice was not a grand gesture performed on a stage. It was a direction chosen when every other direction was easier. The southern garrison was 18 miles from the capital. Vaelor covered the distance in 4 hours, running at a pace that alternated between human sprint and partial wolf shift, his bare feet striking frozen ground hard enough to leave blood on the stone. He did not feel the cold. The wolf's metabolism burned hot enough to keep frostbite at bay, and the adrenaline still flooding his system from the escape rendered pain academic. He arrived at the garrison before dawn. The compound was dark, quiet. The Night Legion did not operate with the visible discipline of regular Imperial forces. No sentries marching predetermined routes, no torches lining the walls. The compound appeared abandoned to anyone who did not know what to look for. Vaelor knew what to look for. He stopped at the tree line and waited. 60 seconds passed. A voice came from behind him. "You are either very brave or very lost, Your Majesty." Vaelor did not turn. Lieutenant Sarah Valk, 3rd Company, Night Operations Specialist. You earned your commission at the Battle of Kren when you held a bridge alone for 40 minutes while your unit evacuated wounded across the Ashenveld River. A pause. "You remember that?" the voice said. "I remember every soldier who earned a commission under my command." Silence. Then a woman stepped from the shadows behind him. She was tall, hard. Her face carried the particular quality of someone who had been shaped by violence the way stone is shaped by water, slowly, relentlessly, until all the soft parts were gone and what remained was functional and unyielding. "Kalis is not here," Sarah said. "I know. He went north, to reach your forces before Maelor's army does." Sarah studied him. Her eyes moved across his torn tunic, his bare feet, the blood on the ground, the combat knife on his forearm, and the short sword at his hip in the absence of everything else that normally accompanied a king. "You look like hell," she said. "That is accurate. Why are you here?" Vaelor turned to face her. And here is where the story arrives at the moment that separates the person a man has been from the person he might become. Because Vaelor Draxor had spent his entire life issuing commands. He had told soldiers where to march, and generals where to fight, and ministers what to legislate, and an entire empire what to believe. Command was not a skill for him. It was identity. Remove the ability to command, and Vaelor did not know who remained. But command requires authority. And authority, Vaelor was learning, was not given by title or taken by force. It was earned by the willingness to stand without title and without force and say the thing that power never says. "I need help," Vaelor said. 2 words. 2 words that the Alpha King of Vaerith, conqueror of 6 nations, the most powerful wolf on the continent, had never spoken in sequence in his entire life. They tasted like blood. They tasted like beginning. Sarah Valk looked at the king for a long time. Then she stepped aside and gestured toward the compound. "Come inside," she said. "You are bleeding on our perimeter, and we have a policy against that." While Vaelor bled into the care of the Night Legion's southern garrison, Maelor Sorn discovered the empty room. He stood in the doorway of the royal quarters and examined the destroyed door with the detached interest of an engineer studying a structural failure. The splintered wood, the torn hinges, the unconscious guard slumped against the corridor wall. He was not angry. Anger was an amateur's response. He was recalculating. The king's escape changed the variables, but not the equation. Maelor had built contingencies for this scenario, the way he had built contingencies for every scenario. The plan was not a line, it was a web. Cut one strand and the rest tightened. He turned to the aide standing behind him. "Dispatch the Ironmark Company to the Southern Territories," Maelor said. "Full battalion strength. Locate the king. Do not engage. Observe and report." He paused. "And send a second force north. The Hollow Sanctum. I want it found and I want it sealed. Whatever records the Eclipse woman is using, I want them buried under enough stone that it would take a century to dig them out." The aide hesitated. "Chancellor, the Northern Territories are Night Legion operational zones. If our forces enter without coordination, Kaelus's soldiers may interpret it as hostile action." Maelor looked at the aide. "It is hostile action," he said. The aide left. Maelor walked to the window of the royal quarters and looked out over the capital. The city spread below in concentric rings of stone and steel. 1,000,000 wolves going about the business of empire without any awareness that the architecture of their world was being redesigned while they slept. This is the nature of institutional power. It operates above the level of individual perception. A farmer in the Eastern Territories would wake this morning and tend his fields and feed his family and never know that the chain of authority governing his taxes, his property rights, his military obligations, and the legal framework protecting his children had been transferred from one man to another in a 4-minute vote conducted before sunrise. Power at this scale is invisible to those who live beneath it. It is only visible to those who hold it. And Maelor held it now. He turned from the window. There was work to do. In the frozen north, Kaelus Thorn moved through the wilderness with the unhurried efficiency of a man who had spent his career operating in territory that wanted him dead. He reached the first Night Legion outpost at midday, a small compound hidden in a ravine staffed by 30 soldiers who specialized in reconnaissance and early warning. They were expecting him. The Night Legion's communication network did not rely on Imperial infrastructure. Kaelus had built a parallel system years ago using wolf runners, scouts capable of covering vast distances at speed and carrying encrypted messages in memory rather than on paper. The system was slow by Imperial standards, but it was invisible to Imperial surveillance, which made it infinitely more valuable than speed. The outpost commander, a scarred woman named Drell, met him at the gate. "How bad?" she asked. Kaelus sat down on a supply crate and accepted a canteen of water. "Maelor has the council," he said. "The king is confined. Executive authority has been transferred under Emergency Provision 9. He drank. "The official narrative is that Selene is an insurgent and I am a traitor. By now, every garrison in the Empire has received orders to detain or kill us on sight." Drell absorbed this without visible reaction. She had the particular composure of someone who had been receiving bad news for so long that the emotional infrastructure for processing it had been replaced by a simple sorting mechanism. Actionable or not actionable? Respond or wait? "What are our orders?" Drell asked. Kaelus looked at her. It was the question he had been carrying since the bonding ceremony. The question that weighed more than the wound Selene had healed, more than the miles of frozen terrain he had crossed, more than the career and the rank and the identity he had abandoned. Because the answer to that question would determine not just the fate of 1,200 soldiers, but the shape of everything that came after. "Our orders," Kaelus said, "are to protect the truth." He set down the canteen. "There is a woman in the Hollow Sanctum who holds the complete historical record of what House Draxor did to the Eclipse Bloodline. That record is the most dangerous weapon on this continent, not because it can kill, because it can prove. And proof, distributed widely enough, makes tyranny impossible because tyranny requires its subjects to believe there is no alternative. The record provides the alternative. Our job is to make sure it reaches every wolf in Vareth before Maelor can bury it." Drell considered this. "That is not a military operation," she said. That is a revolution. No, Kalis said. A revolution replaces one power with another. This replaces ignorance with information. What people do with the information afterward is their choice. Our only obligation is to ensure they get the chance to make it. Drell nodded slowly. Then she looked past Kalis toward the ravine entrance, where a scout had appeared, running at full speed, breath steaming in the cold air. The scout reached them and bent double, hands on knees, gasping. "Commander," the scout said between breaths, "Imperial forces, moving north from the capital. Full battalion strength, Ironmark Company." He straightened. "And a second column heading for the glacier cliffs." Kalis stood. The canteen fell from the crate and spilled water across the frozen stone. "How far?" he asked. "The main force is 2 days south. The glacier column is faster. Light cavalry. They could reach the Hollow Sanctum in 36 hours. Kalis's face changed. Not dramatically. The shift was subtle, a tightening around the eyes, a compression of the jaw, the micro-adjustments of a man whose tactical calculations have just been overwritten by a single variable that turns every contingency into wreckage. Selene was alone in the Hollow Sanctum. The records were with her. And 36 hours was not enough time to transcribe and transport and distribute anything. It was barely enough time to run. He looked at Drell. "Send runners to every Night Legion position between here and the glacier," he said. "Full mobilization. Defensive deployment along the northern passes. We do not engage the Imperial forces. We delay them. Every hour we buy is an hour Selene uses to move the records." Drell turned and started issuing orders before Kalis finished speaking. Kalis stood alone in the outpost yard. He looked north. Somewhere beyond the frozen ridges and the buried ruins and the centuries of accumulated silence, Selene sat in a chamber carved from the memory of a murdered civilization and did not know that an army was coming for her. He had told her he would come back. He had not told her he might not be fast enough. He started running. And the story does not pause here to offer comfort or reassurance, because the truth of this moment is a truth that every person who has ever tried to protect something important has faced. The distance between intention and execution is not measured in miles. It is measured in time. And time is the one resource that cannot be manufactured, borrowed, or stolen. It can only be spent. And it is always, always running out. In the Hollow Sanctum, Selene worked. She did not know about the approaching army. She did not know about Vaelor's escape. She did not know about the council vote or the Ironmark Company or the 36-hour window that was shrinking with every passing minute. She knew only the stone and the words carved into it, and the journal filling with transcribed truth beneath her cramped and ink-stained fingers. She was on the final section of her strategic outline when she heard it. A sound. Not footsteps. Not wind. A vibration. Deep in the stone beneath her. A rhythmic pulse that she felt through her knees and her palms and the base of her spine. It was faint. Barely perceptible. The kind of sound that the conscious mind dismisses as imagination, but the body recognizes with the atavistic certainty of a creature that has survived long enough to know that the ground does not vibrate without cause. She pressed her hand flat against the floor. The vibration intensified, and then, in the silver fire that lived permanently in her veins now, in the eclipse blood that had woken in the bonding circle and had not slept since, she felt something else. A response. The sanctum was responding to her. The carved walls pulsed with a faint luminescence that had not been there before. The lunar symbols brightened. The temperature shifted, not warmer, not colder, but different, charged, as though the air itself had become a conductor for something that was not quite energy, and not quite sound, and not quite light, but shared properties with all three. The floor beneath her hand grew warm, and a voice, not a voice, a pressure, a shaped intention transmitted through stone and blood, and the inherited memory of a lineage that had been building this place for centuries before the first Draxor king ever drew breath, spoke. Not in words, in understanding. The sanctum showed her what was coming. Soldiers, horses, steel, moving through the frozen passes with the methodical efficiency of an empire that had been grinding civilizations into dust for 300 years. They were coming for the records. They were coming to bury the truth a second time, to finish the erasure that Aldrich Draxor had started, and that Maelor Sorn intended to complete. And they would arrive before Kalis could reach her. Selene pulled her hand from the floor. She sat in the cold chamber and looked at the journal in her lap. Months of work. The complete record of a genocide that the Empire had spent 3 generations pretending never happened. Names, dates, locations. The identities of the commanders who carried out the purges, and the officials who authorized them, and the systems that enabled them, and the lies that justified them. Everything. In one journal, in one room, with one woman, and an army 36 hours away. She closed her eyes. And in the darkness behind her eyelids, the Eclipse blood showed her something else. Not the approaching army, not the frozen passes, not the strategic calculus of escape routes and time windows and the mathematics of survival. It showed her the sanctum itself, the chambers she had not yet entered, the levels below the levels she had explored. The deep architecture of a fortress built not merely for preservation, but for something else entirely. The Eclipse Bloodline had not built the hollow sanctum as a library. They had built it as a weapon, and the weapon had been waiting for someone with the blood to activate it. Selene opened her eyes. The silver fire in her veins burned brighter than it had since the bonding ceremony. She stood. She placed the journal carefully on the stone floor, and she walked towards the passage that led downward, into the chambers that had been sealed for 3 centuries, into the depths of a fortress that her ancestors had designed for exactly this moment, the moment when the last heir stood alone against the machine that had consumed her people and had to choose between running and becoming something that could not run because it had become too large and too rooted and too fundamentally changed to fit through any door that led backward. She descended. The stone closed behind her, and above, on the surface, the wind carried the first faint vibrations of hoofbeats across the frozen waste. The army was coming. The truth was underground, and the woman carrying it was no longer the woman who had entered this fortress 3 days ago. That woman had been a survivor. What descended into the deep chambers was something the Empire had never seen and could not prepare for, because survival is a defensive posture, and Selene Vaelor was done defending. The deep chambers were not dark. They glowed. A bioluminescence embedded in the stone itself, veins of mineral that responded to Eclipse blood the way iron responds to a magnet, pulling light from some internal reservoir and releasing it in steady, cold waves that painted the descending corridor in shades of blue and silver. The effect was not beautiful. It was functional. The Eclipse engineers who had designed this place had not been interested in aesthetics. They had been interested in ensuring that whoever came down here could see clearly enough to understand what they were looking at. Selene descended for what felt like an hour, but was probably 12 minutes. The corridor leveled. She stepped into a chamber that was larger than the courtyard of the obsidian citadel. The ceiling was so high it disappeared into shadow. The floor was polished smooth and carved with a single, continuous spiral that began at the chamber's edge and wound inward toward a raised platform at the center. The spiral was not decorative. It was a channel, and the channel was filled with a substance that Selene recognized on a molecular level before her conscious mind could name it. Eclipse blood. Preserved, concentrated, stored in stone channels that maintained its biological properties through some technique she did not understand and did not need to understand because her own blood was already responding. The silver fire in her veins intensified until it hurt, a deep, bone-level ache that felt less like pain and more like resonance, the sensation of a tuning fork vibrating at its exact frequency after years of silence. She walked the spiral inward. With each step, the blood in the channels brightened. The chamber's luminescence shifted from cold blue to hot silver. The air thickened with pressure that was not atmospheric but biological, the weight of concentrated eclipse power filling the space the way water fills a vessel, finding every corner, every crack, every empty space and occupying it completely. She reached the platform. At its center stood a single stone column, waist-high, flat-topped, with a circular depression carved into its surface. The depression was the exact size and depth of a human palm. Selene understood without being told. She placed her hand in the depression, and the weapon activated. It was not what she expected. She had imagined something violent, an explosion, a discharge of power, a force that could be aimed at enemies and unleashed like artillery. Instead, the sanctum opened. Every wall in the deep chamber became transparent. Not physically, the stone remained solid, but Selene could see through it. Her perception expanded outward from the platform in concentric waves, passing through rock and ice and frozen earth and open air until she could perceive the entire landscape surrounding the hollow sanctum for 50 miles in every direction. She saw the army. The Ironmark Company, 800 soldiers in heavy formation, moving through the northern pass in a column that stretched half a mile. Cavalry at the front, infantry behind, supply wagons at the rear guarded by mounted archers. They moved with the disciplined momentum of a professional military force executing a clear objective. No hesitation, no uncertainty, just the mechanical efficiency of an empire projecting its will across distance. They were 14 hours away. She saw more. To the south, a second formation, smaller, faster. Night Legion scouts running in dispersed patterns through the frozen terrain, carrying messages in their blood and their memory, converging on a defensive line that Kalis was assembling across the southern passes. She saw Kalis, running, alone, moving north at a pace that was burning through his reserves faster than his body could replenish them. His face was tight with the specific grimace of a man who knew that the math did not work, that distance and time and the limitations of a human body, even enhanced by wolf blood, added up to a number that fell short. He was not going to reach her before the army did. She saw Vaelor, south, in the Night Legion garrison, surrounded by soldiers who did not know whether to treat him as their king or their prisoner. He was standing in a small room alone, one hand pressed against a stone wall, his head bowed, his wolf burning inside him with the relentless, unsatisfiable hunger of the severed bond. Even at this distance, even through layers of stone and miles of frozen earth, she felt it. The bond, shattered, cauterized, severed by his own words in front of 1,000 witnesses. But not gone. Never gone. Because the mate bond, she understood now, was not a chain. It was not a leash. It was not the mechanism of control that Vaelor had feared and rejected. It was a frequency, a resonance between two wolves whose biological signatures were complementary at such a fundamental level that the bond would persist even after formal severance, the way a bell continues to vibrate after the hammer has been removed. She could feel him vibrating, and she hated that she could, because feeling him meant caring, and caring about a man who had humiliated her in front of an empire was a luxury she could not afford. Not now. Not with an army 14 hours away and records that needed to survive, and a weapon she did not fully understand humming beneath her palm. She pushed the awareness of Vaelor aside. Not gently. She shoved it into the same locked compartment where she had kept her bloodline for 14 years, the place inside her where dangerous truths went to wait until the world was ready for them. She focused on the weapon. The sanctum responded. Information flooded through her palm and into her bloodstream and from there into her brain, bypassing language entirely and arriving as direct comprehension. The weapon was not a single device. It was the sanctum itself. The entire fortress, from the surface entrance to the deepest chamber, was a transmission system, a broadcasting architecture designed to amplify Eclipse blood power across distances that no individual wolf could cover alone. The Eclipse Elders had built it as a last resort. If the bloodline ever faced extinction, if the balancing force they provided to the wolf world was ever eliminated by a dominant power, the sanctum could broadcast the historical records stored in its walls to every wolf on the continent simultaneously. Not as text, not as sound, as memory. Direct neural transmission carried on a frequency that only wolf physiology could receive, implanting the complete and unedited truth of what had happened into the consciousness of every wolf alive. It was not a weapon of destruction. It was a weapon of revelation. And it required one thing to activate fully: all of the Eclipse blood stored in the spiral channels, and the blood of the last heir to catalyze the transmission. Selene understood what that meant. The blood in the channels was finite. It was the preserved biological legacy of her entire bloodline, concentrated and stored over centuries. Using it would exhaust the supply permanently. There would be no second broadcast, no reserve, no possibility of repeating the transmission, and the catalyzation process would pull Eclipse power through her body at a magnitude that no single wolf had ever survived. The weapon worked once, and the person who activated it would not work again. Selene removed her hand from the depression. She stood on the platform in the silver-lit chamber and breathed. In, out, in, out. The rhythm of a person who is not panicking, but who is also not calm. The rhythm of someone standing at the edge of a cliff and measuring the distance to the ground, and understanding with clinical precision exactly what the fall will cost. And here the story must say something about sacrifice that most stories get wrong. Most stories present sacrifice as a moment of noble clarity. The hero sees the stakes, the hero makes the choice, the hero acts, and the audience admires the courage and the selflessness and the willingness to pay the ultimate price for the greater good. But that is not how sacrifice works. Sacrifice is not clean. It is not noble. It is not a single shining moment of decision. Sacrifice is the slow, grinding, nauseating process of understanding exactly what you are about to lose and choosing to lose it anyway while every cell in your body screams at you to find another way. It is standing in a room with the full knowledge that you are 23 years old and have barely begun to live, and the world outside this stone chamber contains mornings you will never see and conversations you will never have, and a man with slate-colored eyes whose hand on your wounded side was the first gentle thing anyone had done for you in 14 years. Sacrifice is grief in advance, and it is the loneliest thing a person can do. Selene stood on the platform for a long time. Then she climbed back up. The surface chambers were cold, empty. Her breath fogged in the air. The journal lay where she had left it on the stone floor, filled with transcribed truth, the portable version of what the walls contained. She picked it up. She held it against her chest. And she waited. Not for rescue. Not for Kalis. Not for the army or the dawn or some miracle that would rewrite the mathematics of her situation into something survivable. She waited for herself. For the version of herself that would be capable of descending back into that chamber and placing her hand on the column and saying yes to the thing that would save everything except her. That version was not ready yet. She sat down. She opened the journal, and she wrote one final entry. Not a strategy, not a record, not a message for the world. A letter. To Kalis. 8 hours later, the first Ironmark scouts reached the glacier cliffs. They found the entrance exposed, the ice shattered, the lunar arch visible in the gray pre-dawn light. They sent word back to the main column and established a perimeter, a ring of armed soldiers surrounding the cliff face with the patient, professional discipline of men who had besieged fortifications before and understood that haste was the enemy of certainty. The main column arrived 4 hours after that. 800 soldiers, siege equipment, supplies for a sustained operation. The commanding officer was a man named Colonel Brennan Voss, not related to General Herrick Voss by blood, but connected by the institutional lineage of military tradition that gave certain surnames weight regardless of genetics. Brennan was 45, efficient, not cruel, but not troubled by cruelty when orders required it. He was the kind of officer that empires produce in bulk, competent enough to execute and incurious enough never to question. He studied the entrance. "One way in," Brennan said. His lieutenant nodded. "Narrow approach. 15 feet high, but only 8 feet wide. Channelizes any attacking force into a single file." "We are not attacking," Brennan said. "We are retrieving. The Chancellor's orders are specific. Secure the records, secure the woman. If the records cannot be removed, destroy them in place." He turned to his siege engineers. "Can you collapse the entrance?" The chief engineer examined the stone arch. "Possibly," she said. "The rock is dense. Volcanic glass composite. It will resist conventional demolition charges. We would need sustained bombardment or direct placement of heavy charges inside the passage itself." "Then we go inside," Brennan said. He organized 3 assault teams of 20 soldiers each. Standard breach protocol. First team enters and secures the immediate interior. Second team pushes deeper. Third team holds the entrance and prevents retreat. The first team entered the hollow sanctum at noon. They made it 80 feet before the corridor sealed behind them. Stone walls dormant for 3 centuries slid into place with a grinding roar that sent vibrations through the cliff face strong enough to shake loose ice from the glacier above. The 20 soldiers found themselves in absolute darkness. Their torches guttered and died in air that had become suddenly, inexplicably thin. Panicked shouting echoed through the sealed corridor. Then the walls began to glow. Silver light, cold and sharp, illuminated carved text that the soldiers could not read but could feel. The words vibrated through the stone and into their bodies, bypassing ears and eyes and speaking directly to the wolves inside them. Ancient words, eclipse words, carrying the compressed weight of a civilization's testimony. The soldiers did not understand the language. Their wolves did. 20 men dropped to their knees simultaneously, not from physical force, from comprehension. The walls were telling them what had been done to the Eclipse Bloodline, not as abstract history, as experience. Transmitted through the biological interface of wolf-to-wolf communication, the soldiers felt the purges, the burning villages, the midnight raids, the children who screamed and the parents who could not reach them. 300 years of buried atrocity compressed into 30 seconds of direct neural input. Several soldiers vomited. One began to weep. The senior sergeant, a veteran of 15 years, pressed his back against the wall and slid to the floor and stared at nothing with the expression of a man whose entire understanding of the institution he served had just been dismantled and rebuilt in a configuration he could not live inside. Outside, Colonel Brennan heard the shouting stop. He waited 5 minutes. He sent the second team. The same thing happened. 40 soldiers. Incapacitated, not wounded, not dead, broken open, forced to receive a truth they had not consented to carry. Brennan pulled his remaining forces back from the entrance. His jaw was tight. He sent a coded dispatch to the capital. Target is defended by unknown countermeasures. Conventional breach ineffective. Requesting authorization for full demolition, complete destruction of the site, and all contents including the target. The dispatch reached Vaelor Sorn 3 hours later. The Chancellor read it once. He set it down. He picked up a pen. Authorized, he wrote. And below that, in smaller letters that the courier would not read, because couriers in Vareth were trained to deliver documents without examining them, no survivors. The courier departed. The demolition order would reach Brennan by dawn. And Selene, deep inside the sanctum, felt the shift. She felt it the way the sea feels a storm approaching from beyond the horizon, not as information, as pressure, a change in the weight of the world above her. They were going to bring the mountain down, bury the sanctum, bury the records, bury the truth a second time, this time under enough stone to ensure it never surfaced again. Bury her with it. She stood. She walked to the passage leading down to the deep chamber. She stopped at the threshold. The letter to Kalis lay on the stone floor behind her, weighted with a small rock so the draft from the corridors would not scatter it. She had written it in plain language. No codes, no hidden meanings, just the words of a woman telling a man what he meant to her and why she was choosing what she was choosing and asking him to carry the grief of it without letting it become the cage she had spent 14 years inside. She did not look back at the letter. Looking back would make it harder. And it was already the hardest thing she had ever done. She descended. The deep chamber blazed with silver light as she entered. The spiral channels pulsed. The platform hummed. The weapon waited with the patient readiness of something that had been designed for exactly one activation and had spent 3 centuries conserving its energy for this moment. Selene climbed the platform. She stood over the column. She placed her hand in the depression. The chamber responded. Power surged up through her arm and into her chest, and she gasped. Not from pain, not yet, but from the sheer volume of it, the overwhelming flood of concentrated eclipse energy pouring through a body that was built for this but had never been tested at this magnitude. Her silver veins ignited. Her vision expanded. The walls went transparent again, and she saw everything. The army outside, the demolition charges being prepared, the courier racing south with the kill order, Kalis running north with blood in his boots, Vaelor standing in a garrison courtyard with his face turned toward the sky. She held on. The weapon began its sequence. The broadcast would take approximately 4 minutes. 4 minutes to transmit 300 years of suppressed history to every wolf on the continent. 4 minutes during which the entire stored reserve of Eclipse blood would flow through her body as a catalyzing agent, amplified by the sanctum's architecture and projected outward on a frequency that would penetrate stone and steel and distance and denial. 4 minutes during which Selene Vaelor would cease to be a person and become a conduit. And conduits, by definition, are consumed by what passes through them. The first minute was bearable. Power flowed through her in waves. Each wave carried a fragment of the historical record, converted from carved stone into biological signal. She felt the fragments leave her, radiating outward through the earth and the air, and the electromagnetic fabric of the world like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. Somewhere, hundreds of miles away, wolves were beginning to receive, beginning to understand, beginning to feel the weight of what had been hidden from them. The second minute was not bearable. The power increased exponentially. The channels in the floor drained toward her like tributaries feeding a river. And the river was her body, and her body was not designed to carry this volume. Her bones ached, her muscles locked. Her vision whited out and then returned in shattered fragments, kaleidoscopic, the world breaking into pieces and reassembling in patterns she could not control. She held on. Blood ran from her nose, from her ears. Silver blood. Eclipse blood. The same blood that had been stored in these channels for 3 centuries was now mixed with her own, and the mixture was burning through her capillaries at a rate that her healing capacity could not match. She held on. The third minute nearly killed her. Her heart stuttered, skipped, restarted with a lurch that made her entire body convulse. The platform cracked beneath her feet. The column vibrated at a frequency that she could feel in her teeth, in her skull, in the marrow of her bones. The chamber walls, transparent in her expanded perception, showed her the broadcast spreading across the continent like a wave of silver light rolling outward from a single point. Wolves were receiving, everywhere. In every territory, every city, every outpost and farm and barracks and tavern, wolves were stopping mid-stride, mid-sentence, mid-breath, as 3 centuries of suppressed truth arrived in their consciousness uninvited and undeniable. They were seeing what she was showing them, the purges, the massacres, the children and the cities and the names erased from history so that a single dynasty could rule without challenge. They were seeing the cost of the Crimson Throne, and no amount of propaganda, no narrative constructed by chancellors, no carefully managed version of history would ever be able to unsee what they had seen. Selene smiled, blood on her teeth, silver fire in her veins, the truth leaving her body one fragment at a time, each fragment a name, a face, a life that had been erased and was now restored, not in flesh but in memory, which is the only form of resurrection that the dead have ever truly needed. The 4th minute began, and in the garrison to the south, Vaelor Draxor dropped to his knees. The broadcast hit him like a wall of compressed ice. His vision went white. His wolf screamed. And into his mind, through the burned and severed remnants of the mate bond, through the connection that he had rejected and destroyed and that persisted anyway because biology does not obey pride, poured the complete record of what his bloodline had done. He saw it all. Every village, every name, every child. And he felt through the bond, through the ghost of the connection that should have been his salvation and became his damnation, the woman who was transmitting it. He felt her dying. The realization hit him with a force that made physical pain irrelevant. She was burning herself alive to broadcast the truth. She was using her own body as fuel for a transmission that would save everyone except her. And he was 200 miles south, on his knees in a garrison courtyard, feeling her life drain through a connection he had severed because he was afraid of what it meant to belong to someone. No, he said. The word came out broken, barely human. The sound of a man whose voice has been reduced to its most fundamental component, the raw animal negation of a creature watching something it cannot prevent. No, no, no! He stood. His wolf surged, not the controlled, disciplined wolf of a king managing his power, not the furious, caged wolf of a man fighting against submission. This was something else entirely, something that had no precedent in the military history of Vareth or the personal history of Vaelor Draxor. This was a wolf that had finally, irrevocably, catastrophically understood what it was losing, and had decided that losing was not acceptable. Vaelor turned south, then stopped, then turned north. Every soldier in the garrison was on the ground. The broadcast had hit them all. They lay in various states of shock, some weeping, some silent, some staring at the sky with expressions that suggested their understanding of the world had been permanently altered. Sarah Valk was the first to recover. She rose from her knees, wiped blood from her nose, and looked at Vaelor with eyes that had changed. The professional assessment was gone. The careful neutrality of a soldier evaluating a deposed king was gone. What remained was something rawer. "You knew," she said. "No," Vaelor said. His voice was wrecked. "I did not know. That is the point. I did not know because I chose not to know. I chose ignorance because ignorance was comfortable, and comfort was easier than truth, and I wrapped that choice in the language of strength so I could sleep at night. He was shaking, not from the broadcast, from the thing he could feel through the bond, the thing that was getting weaker with every passing second. She is dying, Vaelor said. Sarah stared at him. The woman, Selene, she is in the hollow sanctum. She is using the broadcast system and it is killing her. He pressed his fist against his chest. I can feel it. The bond. The bond I broke. It is still there, and she is on the other end of it, and she is dying. The garrison courtyard was silent, except for the wind and the groaning of soldiers pulling themselves off the ground. Sarah looked north. That is 200 miles, she said. Vaelor said nothing. 200 miles, she repeated, through frozen terrain, with an imperial army between here and there, on foot. Vaelor looked at her, and she saw something in his eyes that she had never seen in any commanding officer during her entire career. She had seen courage, she had seen determination, she had seen the cold, calculated resolve of men who understood the odds and chose to fight anyway. She had never seen desperation, not the weak, flailing desperation of a man who has lost control. The focused, compressed, terrifyingly purposeful desperation of a man who has identified the single thing in the universe that matters more than his own survival and has accepted that reaching it will probably destroy him. "Get me a horse," Vaelor said. Sarah did not move. "Your Majesty," she said. "Even at full gallop, even with fresh mounts at every stop, 200 miles takes the better part of 2 days. If the broadcast is killing her now, 2 days is—" She did not finish the sentence. She did not need to. "Get me a horse," Vaelor said again. Sarah looked at him for 3 more seconds. Then she turned and shouted an order that brought 3 soldiers running. 60 seconds later, the fastest horse in the Night Legion's southern garrison stood saddled in the courtyard, breathing steam, muscles trembling with the coiled energy of an animal bred for exactly one thing. Vaelor mounted. He looked down at Sarah. "If I do not come back," he said, "if neither of us comes back. The truth is in the broadcast. Every wolf on the continent has received it. The lie is finished. What happens next is not about kings or thrones or bloodlines. It is about what people do when they finally know the truth and cannot pretend they do not." He kicked the horse. The animal launched forward like a bolt released from a crossbow. Vaelor Draxor rode north. Behind him, the garrison watched the king disappear into the frozen dark. Sarah stood in the courtyard for a long time after the hoofbeats faded. Then she turned to the remaining soldiers. "Full mobilization," she said. "We ride north. All of us. Every wolf who can stand." A soldier looked at her. "Ma'am, we have no orders from Commander Thorne." Sarah looked at the soldier with an expression that communicated with perfect clarity that the time for waiting for orders had ended approximately 4 minutes ago when 300 years of suppressed genocide arrived in their collective consciousness like a hammer to the skull. "The commander will understand," she said. They rode. North, into the dark. Into the storm that was building above the hollow sanctum where an army prepared to bury a mountain and a woman burned herself alive to save a truth, and a king rode toward both at a speed that his body could not sustain and his heart could not reduce. And the 4th minute of the broadcast stretched into something that felt like forever. And Selene held on. Blood on the platform. Silver fire dimming. Heart stuttering. Bones fracturing under the strain of channeling 3 centuries of concentrated power through a single human body. She held on. Because the broadcast was not finished. Because the last fragment of truth had not yet been transmitted. Because somewhere, 200 miles south and closing fast, a wolf she had every right to hate was destroying himself trying to reach her, and she could feel him coming, through the shattered bond, through the ghost of a connection that should have been dead. She could feel him, and the feeling was not love. Not yet. Not here, on the edge of annihilation, with her body breaking apart and her blood burning silver, and the weight of 12,000 ghosts passing through her like wind through shattered glass. The feeling was simpler than love. It was recognition. The same recognition that had passed between her and Kalis in the courtyard. The same recognition that exists between all people who have looked into the dark and chosen to keep breathing. She recognized the man riding toward her. Not the king, not the Alpha. The man beneath both masks. The man who was terrified and wrong and desperate, and for the first time in his life, moving towards something instead of conquering it. She held on. The broadcast entered its final sequence. The last fragment left her body. The last name. The last face. The last erased life restored to the memory of a continent. And then the power stopped, and the silence that followed was the loudest sound Selene had ever heard. She collapsed. The platform caught her. The silver light in her veins guttered like a candle in a hurricane, flickering between presence and absence, life and its opposite. Above her, through the transparent stone, she could see the Ironmark Company placing demolition charges against the cliff face. She could hear the distant thunder of hoofbeats. She could feel the bond burning, and then she could not feel anything at all. The demolition charges detonated at dawn. Colonel Brennan gave the order from a command position 300 yards back, standing behind a wall of packed snow and iron shields designed to absorb shrapnel. The charges had been placed in a ring around the entrance arch, driven into the volcanic glass with pneumatic drills that took 4 hours to penetrate stone that had resisted natural erosion for centuries. The explosion was not loud. It was deep. A subsonic concussion that traveled through the ground rather than the air, shaking the glacier cliffs hard enough to send cascades of ice tumbling from the upper ridges. The entrance arch cracked. Fissures raced through the carved stone like veins of lightning frozen in rock. Dust and fragments erupted outward in a gray cloud that billowed across the perimeter and coated every soldier in a fine layer of pulverized history. When the dust cleared, the arch was still standing, damaged, fractured, leaning at an angle that defied structural logic, but standing. Brennan stared at it. Again, he said. The engineers placed a second ring of charges, heavier, deeper. This time they did not target the arch itself, but the cliff face above it, intending to bring the weight of the mountain down on the entrance and seal it under 1,000 tons of rubble. The second detonation brought the cliff down. Rock and ice and frozen earth collapsed in a roaring avalanche that buried the entrance under a mass of debris that would take weeks to clear by hand and months by machine. The sound of it echoed across the frozen waste for miles, a dying thunder that rolled through the empty landscape and faded into the silence of a world that had just watched a grave being sealed for the second time. Brennan watched the settling debris. "Mark the coordinates," he said. "Send confirmation to the Chancellor. Target site destroyed. Contents buried. No survivors." His aide wrote the dispatch. And 200 feet below the collapsed entrance, in a chamber that the explosion had shaken but not breached, Selene Vaelor lay on the platform in the dark. The silver light was gone. The channels in the floor were empty. The stored Eclipse blood, 3 centuries of preserved biological legacy, had been consumed entirely by the broadcast. The bioluminescent veins in the walls had dimmed to nothing. The chamber was lightless, airless, in the way that deep underground spaces become when their ventilation systems are blocked by a few thousand tons of fallen mountain. Selene was not conscious. She was not dead. She existed in the space between, the narrow corridor where the body has not yet decided whether to commit to survival or surrender, where biological processes continue on momentum alone, while the deeper systems, the ones that determine whether an organism fights its way back to awareness or slides quietly into permanent stillness, negotiate in a language that has no human translation. Her heartbeat was faint, irregular. The rhythm of a drum being struck by a hand that keeps forgetting it is supposed to be keeping time. Blood pooled beneath her head. Silver blood, dimming to gray as the Eclipse properties faded from it. She had given everything, every stored reserve, every inherited capacity. The biological legacy of 12,000 people had passed through her body in 4 minutes and left behind a vessel that was intact in structure but emptied of the force that had animated it. The broadcast had worked. Every wolf on the continent had received the transmission. 300 years of suppressed truth now lived in the collective memory of an entire civilization, as permanent and indelible as a scar, impossible to unsee, impossible to unfeel, impossible to return to the comfortable ignorance that had allowed empires to flourish on graves. The truth was free, and the woman who had freed it was buried alive in the dark. And here the story must reckon with something that narratives about heroism rarely address honestly. The cost is not theatrical. It is not the dramatic, cinematic moment of sacrifice that audiences process as entertainment and then release. The cost is a 23-year-old woman lying alone in the dark, with her blood cooling on stone, while the world she saved continues turning above her without any immediate awareness that she exists. The cost is loneliness, not the poetic loneliness of tragic figures and songs. The actual, physical, biological loneliness of a body shutting down in a sealed chamber with no one to witness it, and no guarantee that witnessing would change the outcome. This is what sacrifice looks like when the cameras are off. This is what it costs. 40 miles south, Kalis Thorne felt the broadcast end. He had been running for 18 hours. His body had passed through the stages of exhaustion in sequence. The burning muscles, the leaden limbs, the nausea, the tunnel vision, and had arrived at the stage beyond exhaustion where the body stops complaining because complaining requires energy it no longer has. He moved on will alone. Pure, distilled, unreasonable will. The kind that rational people call madness and survivors call Tuesday. The broadcast had hit him while running. He had stumbled, fallen, rolled, and lain on the frozen ground for 90 seconds while 3 centuries of atrocity poured through his consciousness. He had seen everything, felt everything, understood everything, and he had felt Selene at the center of it. Her presence in the broadcast was unmistakable. Not as narrator, as medium. He could feel her body breaking under the strain, could feel the power tearing through her the way a river tears through a dam that is too small to contain it. And then the broadcast ended, and her presence vanished. Not faded, vanished. Like a candle flame pinched between fingers. One moment there, the next gone, leaving behind the specific quality of darkness that only exists in spaces where light used to be. Kalis stopped running. He stood in the frozen waste and pressed his hand against his chest and felt nothing. Nothing where she had been. Nothing where the quiet, steady warmth of her existence had registered in his awareness like a distant fire visible through trees. Nothing. He closed his eyes, and in the silence of the frozen landscape, with the wind cutting through his armor and his legs shaking beneath him and his lungs burning with cold air that tasted like iron, Kalis Thorne made a sound that was not a word and not a howl, and not a scream. It was the sound of a man breaking, not the dramatic, performative breaking of stories, the real kind, the kind that happens in the joints of the soul where load-bearing beliefs connect, the belief that effort equals outcome, that speed equals rescue, that wanting something badly enough can rewrite the physics of distance and time. Those beliefs broke. And what remained was a man standing alone in a frozen field with nothing left to run toward. He stood there for a long time. Then he started walking. Not running. Walking. Because running implied urgency, and urgency implied hope, and hope implied the possibility of an outcome he could influence. He walked toward the hollow sanctum because it was the last place she had been, and because the letter she had left was there, and because a man who has lost the only thing that mattered does not stop moving. He stops running, but he does not stop moving, because stopping is a decision, and decisions require a future, and the future is a concept that requires revision when the person who occupied it is gone. He walked. Vaelor Draxor's horse died 14 miles from the hollow sanctum. The animal had given everything. 17 hours of sustained gallop across frozen terrain, through mountain passes and river crossings and stretches of ice that no sane rider would have attempted at walking speed, let alone at the velocity Vaelor demanded. The horse's heart, massive and powerful and bred for exactly this kind of extremity, simply stopped. The animal went down mid-stride, legs folding, body rolling, and Vaelor was thrown clear and landed hard on frozen ground that knocked the air from his lungs and cracked 2 ribs on his left side. He lay on his back and stared at the sky. Gray, cold, empty. The bond in his chest was silent. He could not feel Selene. He had been able to feel her for the entire ride, faintly. Through the shattered remnants of the connection, a pulse, dim and irregular, but present. A proof of life transmitted across distance through biological channels that the formal severance had damaged but not destroyed. The pulse was gone. Vaelor pressed his fist against his sternum. Nothing. He stood up. His ribs ground against each other. Pain lanced through his left side with every breath. His legs were cramped from 17 hours in the saddle. His hands were cut from the reins, and his face was raw from wind and cold and the accumulated damage of a ride that had been less an act of transportation and more an act of controlled self-destruction. He started walking, 14 miles, broken ribs, no horse, frozen terrain, and the silence in his chest where the bond used to burn. He walked. And this is what must be said about Vaelor Draxor, because the story cannot end without reckoning with the man at its center. He was not a good man. He had rejected his mate in public. He had enabled a genocide by refusing to examine the foundations of his own power. He had allowed a manipulator to shape his identity for 20 years because the shape was comfortable, and comfort was preferable to the terrifying work of self-examination. He was not a good man, but he was, at this moment, walking 14 miles on broken ribs toward a woman he could no longer feel, driven by something that was not love, not yet, because love requires a relationship and they had never had one, driven by something more fundamental. Accountability. Not the performative accountability of public apologies and political theater, the kind that has no audience, the kind that exists only between a man and the consequences of his choices, witnessed by no one, applauded by no one, recorded nowhere. He walked because he owed a debt that could not be paid but had to be acknowledged. An acknowledgement, unlike payment, does not require the creditor to be alive. He reached the hollow sanctum at dusk. The entrance was buried. He stood before the mountain of collapsed rock and ice and understood, with the specific clarity that accompanies the worst moments of a human life, what had happened. The Imperial Army had brought the cliff down, sealed the entrance, buried everything inside, including her. Vaelor dropped to his knees in front of the rubble. His hands found the stone, and he began to dig, not with tools, not with equipment, not with the organized, efficient methodology of a trained soldier. With his bare hands, fingers clawing at rock and ice, tearing skin, breaking nails, leaving smears of blood on gray stone that the cold turned dark almost immediately. He dug. It was pointless. Rational assessment made this clear. Thousands of tons of debris. One man, broken ribs, bare hands. The mathematics of the situation were not ambiguous. They were absolute. He could dig for 100 years and not reach the chamber where she lay. He dug anyway. Because rationality is a tool, and tools serve the purposes of the people who wield them, and Vaelor Draxor's purpose at this moment was not rational. It was the most irrational thing he had ever done, and it was the most honest. He dug until his fingers were raw, until the blood on the stone was continuous, until the pain in his ribs became so severe that each breath was a conscious decision to continue breathing. Then he stopped. Not because he chose to stop, because his body simply refused to continue. His arms dropped. His forehead pressed against the cold stone. His breath came in ragged, broken gasps that fogged the rock surface and vanished. And in the silence of the frozen dusk, kneeling before a sealed mountain with bloody hands and broken ribs, and the empty space in his chest where a bond used to live, the Alpha King of Vaelor did something he had not done since he was a child. He spoke to someone who could not hear him. "I am sorry," he said. The words came out cracked, barely audible, spoken into stone that would absorb them without echo. "I am sorry I rejected you. I am sorry I chose pride. I am sorry I built my entire life on a doctrine that made strength indistinguishable from cruelty and called the result kingship." He paused. His breath shuddered. "You asked me in the courtyard how much of what I called mine was ever truly mine. The answer is nothing. Nothing was mine. Not the throne, not the victories, not the doctrine, not even the rejection. Vaelor built it all, and I lived inside it and called it identity." He pressed his bloody hand flat against the stone. "You are the only real thing I ever encountered, and I threw you away because real things are terrifying to a man who has lived his entire life inside a construction." The stone did not answer. The wind blew, the sky darkened, and then, deep beneath the rubble, deep beneath the collapsed cliff and the sealed corridors and the empty chambers, a pulse, faint, irregular. The biological whisper of a heartbeat transmitted through stone and bone and the ghost of a connection that should not have existed. Vaelor felt it. His head came up. His wolf surged. "Alive," the wolf said. "Alive." The word rewired him. Everything that had been collapsing, the exhaustion, the grief, the resignation, reversed. Adrenaline flooded a system that had been running on empty, and the empty became full and the full became force. Vaelor stood. He placed both hands on the rubble, and he pushed, not with muscle alone. With the Alpha command that lived in his blood, the biological authority that could force submission in other wolves, turned inward, directed not at people but at his own body, demanding that his muscles perform beyond their capacity, that his broken ribs hold together, that his torn hands grip harder, that every fiber and tendon and nerve operate at a level that the human body is designed to reach only once, and only in the moment when the alternative to extraordinary effort is a loss too large to survive. Rock shifted. A boulder the size of a man's torso ground forward and toppled from the pile. Another followed, then another. The rubble cascaded outward from the point of Vaelor's effort, creating a channel, narrow and unstable, but opening, each removed stone revealing the next and the next after that. He was not alone. Kalis arrived from the south. On foot. Wrecked. His face gray with exhaustion, his eyes carrying the specific deadness of a man who has accepted loss and has not yet been informed that the loss may be incomplete. He saw Vaelor digging. He did not ask questions. He started digging beside him. Two men. One a king with nothing left to rule. One a commander with nothing left to command. Side by side, hands bloody, moving stone. They did not speak. They did not need to. The Night Legion arrived 2 hours later. Sarah Valk at the lead, with 60 mounted soldiers who had ridden through the night. They dismounted, assessed the situation in the practice seconds that combat veterans require, and joined the dig without orders. 62 wolves, moving a mountain, stone by stone. It took 7 hours. At 3 a.m, Kalis's hand broke through into open air. The corridor beneath the rubble was intact. The sanctum's internal architecture, designed by engineers who had anticipated exactly this kind of assault, had held. The ceiling had cracked. Debris had filled the entrance passage for 40 feet, but the deeper chambers remained sealed and stable, protected by the same engineering that had preserved the carved records for 3 centuries. Kalis went in first. He moved through the dark corridor by touch, his fingers trailing the carved walls, navigating by the texture of symbols he had learned to read during those first days in the sanctum. The air was thin, cold, dead. He reached the passage to the deep chamber. He descended. He found her. She was lying on the platform. Still, small. Her skin pale to the point of translucence, the silver veins dimmed to the faintest thread of gray. Blood had pooled beneath her head and dried in a dark corona on the stone. Kalis knelt beside her. He pressed 2 fingers to her throat and felt the pulse. Weak, thread-like. The heartbeat of a body that had expended everything it had and was operating on the barest minimum required to maintain cellular function. But present, alive. He gathered her off the stone. She weighed nothing. The broadcast had consumed her reserves so completely that she felt like a child in his arms, her head against his shoulder, her breath so shallow it barely registered against his skin. He carried her up, through the dark corridor, through the rubble-choked passage, through the narrow channel carved by bloody hands and desperate effort. He emerged into the night. Vaelor was standing at the entrance. Their eyes met. Kalis held Selene. Vaelor stood empty-handed. 2 men who had arrived at the same woman from opposite directions, one through loyalty and one through guilt, and neither with any claim on her that she had not yet chosen to grant. "Is she alive?" Vaelor said. "Yes," Kalis said. The word hung between them. Vaelor looked at Selene's face, at the dried blood, at the gray veins, at the stillness that was not death but was closer to death than anything he had ever seen in a living person. His wolf keened, a long, low sound that resonated in his chest and leaked into the night air as a vibration that every wolf present could feel. Loss, recognition, the specific grief of an animal that has finally identified its mate and found her broken. Vaelor reached out. Kalis did not move. Vaelor's hand stopped in the air between them. His bloody fingers hovered over Selene's face without touching. He pulled his hand back. "She is yours to protect," Vaelor said. His voice was quiet, not defeated. Something else. Something that sounded like the first honest sentence he had spoken since he learned to speak. "I had my chance. I destroyed it. What happens now is not my decision. Kalis looked at the king, and something shifted between them. Not forgiveness, not alliance. Something more practical and more durable than either. Acknowledgement. The acknowledgement of two men who understood that the woman between them was not a prize to be claimed or a bond to be competed for, but a person who had burned herself alive to save a world that had done nothing to deserve saving, and the only appropriate response to that kind of sacrifice was to ensure that her survival meant something. She needs warmth, Kalis said. Medical attention, shelter. Sarah Valk appeared beside them with blankets and a field medical kit. She did not wait for instructions. She wrapped Selene in wool and fur, checked her pulse and pupils and breathing, and began the careful, patient work of stabilizing a body that had been pushed past every boundary the biological sciences recognized. Selene did not wake. Not that night, not the next day. She lay in a field tent surrounded by Night Legion soldiers, who took shifts watching over her with the quiet intensity of people guarding something they had only just learned to value. Vaelor sat outside the tent. He did not enter. He did not ask to enter. He sat in the frozen dark with his broken ribs and his bloody hands, and he waited. And waiting, he discovered, was harder than any battle he had ever fought, because waiting required the one thing that conquest never demanded: patience with uncertainty. Selene woke on the third day. The light was soft, filtered through canvas that turned the gray winter sky into something warmer. She was wrapped in furs. Her body ached with a depth that suggested the pain was not superficial but structural, the protest of systems that had been pushed beyond design specifications and were now engaged in the slow, unglamorous work of rebuilding. Kalis was beside her, asleep, sitting on the ground with his back against a supply crate and his head tilted at an angle that would give him a stiff neck for days. His face was thinner than she remembered, older. 3 days of running and digging and waiting had carved lines into his features that would not fade. She watched him breathe, in, out, the rhythm of a man who had not stopped. She reached out and touched his hand. He woke instantly. Their eyes met. Neither of them smiled. Smiling felt insufficient. What passed between them was quieter than joy and deeper than relief. It was the mutual recognition of two people who had each independently accepted that the other was gone and had continued functioning anyway, because that is what people who have survived extinction learn to do. They function, they persist, they keep moving forward even when forward leads nowhere, and then sometimes forward leads somewhere after all. "You came back," she said. He looked at her with slate-colored eyes that held everything he could not say, and said it anyway. "I never left," he said. "I just took the long way around." She almost laughed. The sound came out as a cough, and the cough hurt, but the hurt was alive, and being alive was enough. Kalis told her what had happened. The Night Legion mobilization, the Imperial Army, the demolition, the digging, Vaelor. He told her about the king. Selene listened without expression. When Kalis finished, she was quiet for a long time. "Where is he?" she asked. "Outside," Kalis said. "He has been outside for 3 days. He will not enter the tent. He will not eat unless someone brings him food. He sits in the snow and waits." "For what?" "I do not think he knows." Selene closed her eyes, and behind her eyelids, in the dark space where the Eclipse fire used to burn bright enough to light chambers and shatter seals and broadcast truth across a continent, a faint glow remained. Not the inferno, not the weapon, just a spark. The irreducible minimum of the bloodline that had survived purges and erasure and 3 centuries of institutional silence. A spark is not a fire, but every fire begins as one. She opened her eyes. "Help me stand," she said. Kalis helped her to her feet. The world tilted, her legs shook, her vision blurred at the edges. She gripped his arm with both hands and steadied herself through will rather than balance, because balance was a luxury and will was a habit. She walked to the tent entrance. Kalis held the flap. She stepped outside. The cold hit her. The light hit her. The vast frozen landscape spread around her in every direction, gray and white and empty except for the Night Legion camp and the distant profile of the ruined cliff face. Vaelor was sitting 30 feet away, on the ground, in the snow, his hands wrapped in blood-stained bandages, his face raw from cold. His amber eyes, when they found her, carried the specific quality of a man who has been staring at a door for 3 days and has just seen it open. He did not stand. He did not speak. He looked at her the way a man looks at the thing he destroyed when he sees it rebuilt. Selene walked toward him. Each step cost her something. Energy she did not have, strength she had already spent. The simple mechanical effort of moving a body that had channeled enough power to reach every wolf on a continent and had survived the transit by a margin so thin that the difference between life and death could be measured in individual heartbeats. She stopped in front of him. He looked up at her from the ground, and the distance between them, 3 feet of frozen air, contained the weight of everything that had happened. The rejection, the humiliation, the purges and the lies and the centuries of manufactured ignorance, the bond he had shattered, the empire he had failed, the woman he had thrown away because she did not match the shape of the cage he lived inside. All of it. In 3 feet. "You dug," she said. His jaw worked. His eyes were bright. Not with tears. With the effort of containing something that tears would have been insufficient to express. "Yes," he said. "With your hands." "Yes." "Why?" The question was simple. The answer was not. "Because I owed you," Vaelor said. "Not the bond, not the mate claim, not any of the things I was supposed to feel and refused to feel, because feeling them would have meant admitting I was wrong about everything." He paused. "I owed you the truth. And the truth is that I was wrong. About power, about strength, about what a king is supposed to be. I was wrong about all of it. And I know that being wrong does not earn forgiveness, and I am not asking for forgiveness. I am asking for the chance to be something other than what I was." Selene looked at him for a long time. And here is what must be said about forgiveness, because the story demands honesty rather than comfort. Selene did not forgive him, not in that moment, not on that frozen ground. Forgiveness is not a switch that flips when the person who wronged you says the right words in the right tone with the right amount of blood on their hands. Forgiveness is a process. It is slow and uneven, and it advances and retreats, and sometimes it arrives fully, and sometimes it arrives in pieces, and sometimes it never arrives at all. And all of those outcomes are legitimate. What Selene offered instead was something different. She offered acknowledgement. "I see you," she said. "I see what you did. I see what it cost. And I do not owe you anything for it." She paused. "But I see you. And that is where we start. If we start at all." Vaelor bowed his head. Not the bow of a king granting favor. Not the bow of a wolf submitting to a stronger wolf. The bow of a man accepting terms he did not set and understanding for the first time in his life that accepting terms you did not set is not weakness. It is the beginning of every honest relationship in human history. The empire did not heal quickly. It did not heal cleanly. The broadcast had detonated like a bomb in the collective consciousness of Vareth, and the aftermath was as messy and complicated and contradictory as the aftermath of any revelation that dismantles the mythology a civilization has used to justify itself. There were riots. There were recriminations. There were wolves who refused to believe the transmission, and wolves who had always suspected, and wolves who believed it, but argued that it did not matter because it happened 300 years ago, and dwelling on the past was weakness. There were wolves who wept. Maelor Sorn did not survive the transition. His end was not dramatic. It was administrative. The same tool he had used to control the empire was turned against him with the same mechanical efficiency he had applied to everything else. Evidence of his manipulation, compiled by Herrick Voss and 3 council members who had voted against Emergency Provision 9, was presented to a reconvened council that no longer answered to a chancellor who had lost the ability to control the narrative. He was found in his office, the locked drawer open. The leather journal on his desk turned to the page that read The Eclipse Lives. He was seated, composed, his hands clasped behind his back one final time. He had taken the decision out of others' hands. The journal was preserved as evidence and later included in the historical archive that Selene established in the rebuilt capital. The Crimson Throne was melted, not ceremonially, not symbolically. The decision was practical. The metal from 17 conquered kingdoms' weapons was reforged into structural beams used to rebuild the sections of the capital that had been damaged during the unrest. The throne room became a council chamber. The 40 steps were reduced to 3. Vaelor abdicated. He did not fight it. He did not negotiate. He signed the documents that Herrick Voss presented to him and walked out of the citadel, carrying nothing except the clothes on his back and the scars on his hands from the night he had dug through a mountain. He settled in the northern territories, in a small house built from local stone, near the hollow sanctum, which was restored and preserved as a memorial and a warning and a library open to every wolf in Vareth regardless of bloodline. He lived quietly, and the quiet, after a lifetime of noise, was the most difficult territory he had ever navigated. Selene became the keeper of the Eclipse legacy, not a queen, not a ruler, a guardian of memory. Her role was to ensure that the historical record remained accessible and unedited, that no future power could erase a people or a truth for political convenience. The spark of Eclipse fire in her veins never fully reignited. The broadcast had consumed the vast majority of her inherited power. What remained was enough to maintain the sanctum's systems and to sense the biological equilibrium of the wolf population, a distant echo of the regulatory function her ancestors had performed. It was enough. Caelus stayed. He resigned his commission, disbanded the Night Legion voluntarily, transferring its personnel into a new defensive force that answered to the Covenant rather than to any individual. He moved to the northern territories. He built a house near the sanctum, near Selene. Their love was not dramatic. It did not arrive in a flash of silver fire or a surge of biological imperative. It arrived the way water arrives in a drought, slowly, in small amounts, absorbed immediately by ground that had been dry for so long it had forgotten what moisture felt like. It arrived in quiet mornings and shared meals and the specific intimacy of two people who had seen each other at their worst and their most broken and had chosen to remain. The sacred mate bond never returned. Selene did not mourn it. Caelus never mentioned it, because they had learned something that the mate bond, for all its biological power and ancestral significance, could never teach. Love chosen freely, without the compulsion of fate or the pressure of destiny, without the hormonal override of a bond that removes the element of decision, carries a weight that compelled love cannot match. Because chosen love includes the possibility of not choosing, and the daily, unremarkable, unheroic act of choosing someone again and again and again, in the morning and at night and in the tedious hours between, is the most powerful thing two people can do. It is not romantic. It is not cinematic. It is just true. Vaelor visited the sanctum once a year. He came alone. He walked the spiral corridors. He read the walls. He stood in the deep chamber where Selene had nearly died, and he placed his hand on the column where hers had rested, and he felt nothing, because the weapon was spent and the blood was consumed, and the only thing that remained was stone. He never spoke to Selene during these visits. She knew he came. She allowed it. That allowance was not forgiveness. It was not love. It was the quiet, unsentimental acknowledgement that the man who had nearly destroyed her had also helped dig her out of a grave, and that complexity was not something that needed to be resolved. It needed to be carried. And carrying complexity, she had learned, was the price of being alive in a world that refused to sort itself into simple categories of villain and hero, wrong and right, damaged and whole. On an evening in late autumn, 3 years after the broadcast, Selene stood on the cliffs above the restored capital and watched the sun descend behind a skyline that no longer included the obsidian towers of House Draxor. The city below was not perfect. The Covenant was messy. Shared rule was slower than monarchy and more contentious and prone to the specific frustrations that arise when no single voice can silence dissent. But it was alive. The wolves below her were arguing and building and failing and trying again and making the 10,000 small, imperfect decisions that constitute the daily life of a civilization that has decided to face its own history rather than bury it. Caelus appeared beside her. He did not speak. He stood next to her and watched the same sunset and breathed the same air and existed in the same moment without the need to fill it with words. She leaned against him, not because she was weak, because leaning was a choice. And choices made freely, without compulsion or obligation or the weight of destiny pressing down like a crown, are the strongest things in the world. The wind carried the last light across the capital. No chains in it, no prophecy. Only the ordinary, extraordinary fact of two people standing together at the end of a story that had nearly killed them both, choosing each other not because fate demanded it, but because they wanted to. And wanting, they had learned, was enough. It had always been enough. Below them, the Empire breathed. Not perfect, not innocent, but finally, irreversibly, awake.